I never told my husband I served 28 years in the military. He thought I was just a sweet, mild-mannered housewife until my daughter sent her secret distress code. 15 minutes later, I was standing in a country club tearing his empire down to the studs. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The burner phone was hidden deep beneath a 5-pound bag of organic almond flour in my pristine suburban kitchen. I was in the middle of kneading dough for Derricks' favorite artisan bread when the device began to vibrate against the marble countertop. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I wiped the sticky dough off my hands with a linen towel and locked the kitchen door. Nobody had this encrypted number except my 21-year-old daughter Jada. I dug through the flour and pulled out the heavy black device, the screen illuminated with a single text message. Code Black 7 Oakridge Country Club, private dining room. I stared at the glowing letters as the blood rushed to my ears. Code Black 7 was not a joke. It was a strict military distress signal Jada and I had established years ago when my deployments got dangerous. It meant she was being held against her will and being coerced to sign dangerous or legally binding documents. I dropped the floral apron onto the floor. The gentle, submissive housewife persona I had worn for Derrick and his pretentious family for the past decade melted away in an instant. I walked into the walk-in pantry, moved a row of imported olive oils, and pressed my thumb against a biometric scanner hidden seamlessly in the custom woodwork. A compartment slid open. I bypassed the loaded sidearm and instead pulled out a black titanium card and a thick classified dossier I had been building for the last 6 months. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, leaving the dough to rot on the counter. I drove my modest hybrid SUV the 15 miles to Oakridge Country Club in record time, calculating every variable along the way. Oakridge was Derrick's absolute favorite place to flex his wealth. He was a real estate developer who loved to parade his version of black excellence around town, but behind closed doors, he was a textbook narcissist who used money to control everyone in his orbit. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the club, completely ignoring the valet, who shouted that I could not park in the fire lane. I marched straight through the heavy mahogany double doors. The lobby was filled with the city's elite sipping mimosas and discussing stock portfolios, but I did not look left or right. I knew exactly where the private dining room was. I pushed the heavy oak doors open without bothering to knock. The scene inside made my blood run cold. Derrick was standing over Jada, looming over her like a predator. Next to him was Heather, his white sister-in-law. Heather was married to Derrick's younger brother, and she carried herself with a sickening level of entitlement, always dropping racial microaggressions disguised as polite advice. Right now, they were physically blocking Jada from sliding out of the circular leather booth. Jada looked pale and terrified, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse to her chest. On the table in front of her was a thick stack of legal documents. Heather leaned in with that condescending smirk she always reserved for me and my daughter. She slid a heavy gold-plated pen toward Jada across the polished mahogany table. "Sign the trust over, sweetie," Heather said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You have to be realistic about your situation. Your mother is just a dependent housewife living off Derrick's money. She does not understand high-level finance, and frankly, you people always seem to struggle with financial literacy when things get tough. Who do you think will pay your expensive college tuition when your father's company goes under because of a minor cash flow issue? Be a good girl and help your father save the family legacy." Derrick placed a heavy hand on Jada's shoulder, squeezing it tight enough to make her wince. "Listen to your Aunt Jada," he commanded in his deep, authoritative voice. "I am trying to protect you. If you do not sign this transfer today, the government will seize your trust fund anyway. Do not be ungrateful after everything I have provided for you. You know your mother cannot help you. She is weak. She relies on me just like you do." Jada looked up with tears in her eyes, and that is when she saw me standing in the doorway. Her shoulders instantly relaxed. Before Jada could even reach for the pen, I crossed the room in 3 strides. My hands slammed down flat on the document, pinning it to the table. I ripped the legal paperwork squarely in half, right down the middle of the signature line. I did not stop there. I tore it again and again until it was nothing but useless confetti and threw the pieces directly into Derricks' half-empty glass of expensive red wine. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. Heather gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace and stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. Derricks' face contorted in absolute rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk tie. "What the hell is wrong with you, Valerie?" he exploded, his voice booming loudly enough to make the waitstaff outside the glass doors freeze in their tracks. "You come into my club and embarrass me like this. You are nothing but a charity case. I rescued you from a miserable administrative desk at the VA hospital. You were making pennies pushing papers for veterans, and I gave you a mansion. I gave you this life. You do not disrespect me in front of my family." He wanted me to shrink. He wanted me to cry and apologize like the obedient wife he thought he had molded. Instead, I stood perfectly still, my posture flawless, my expression entirely, completely blank. My silence only infuriated him more. He turned his back to me and snapped his fingers aggressively at the terrified waiter who was hovering near the entrance. "Bring the $5,000 champagne bill right now," Derrick shouted, puffing out his chest. "Let us show my ungrateful wife who actually pays for her comfortable little life. Let us remind her who holds the power in this family." I did not scream back. I did not defend my honor. I simply looked him dead in the eye, reached into my coat pocket, and silently tapped a single command on my encrypted phone. The waiter rushed over trembling as he presented the leather binder holding the exorbitant bill. Derrick pulled out his prized black card with a dramatic flourish and slapped it onto the silver tray, shooting a smug, victorious look at Heather. Heather smirked back, crossing her arms, as if they had just put me in my place. The waiter scurried back to the point-of-sale terminal in the corner of the dining room. A suffocating silence hung over the table. I looked at Jada and gave her a small, reassuring nod. A moment later, the waiter returned. He was sweating profusely, his hands shaking as he held the black card out to Derrick. "Sir, I am so incredibly sorry," the waiter stammered, keeping his eyes glued to the floor. "Your card has been declined." The smug look vanished from Derrick's face instantly. He snatched the card back, his dark skin turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Do not be ridiculous," he hissed, lowering his voice to avoid the stares of the wealthy patrons who were now peering eagerly through the glass doors. "Run it again. Your machine is broken." "I ran it 3 times, sir," the waiter whispered. "It says, contact your institution immediately." Derrick violently pulled out his wallet and threw a platinum credit card onto the tray. "Run that one," he demanded. 30 seconds later, the waiter returned, looking like he was about to pass out from fear. The club manager was now standing right behind him, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Declined, sir," the manager said softly. "Every card you have on file has been blocked by the issuer. There is a federal hold message on the account." Humiliated in front of Heather and the elite country club peers, who were now openly whispering and pointing, Derrick lost whatever was left of his mind. He slammed his fists onto the table, rattling the expensive silverware. "Security!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. "Call the police right now. My wife is trespassing. She is harassing my guests, and she has clearly committed some kind of fraud against my accounts. Have her arrested." Heather pulled out her phone, eagerly dialing 911 while Derrick continued to shout obscenities at me, demanding I leave the premises. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my tactical calm, as the country club manager ran into the room, apologizing profusely to the surrounding guests. Within 5 minutes, the heavy doors swung open and 2 armed city police officers stormed into the private dining room. Derrick pointed a shaking, furious finger right at my chest. "Arrest her, officer," he demanded, playing the role of the outraged, wealthy victim to perfection. "She is unhinged, she destroyed vital legal documents, and she is threatening my family. Get her out of my sight." The senior officer, a large man with a stern expression, stepped forward heavily. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt and grabbed my left wrist violently, twisting my arm to pull my hands behind my back. As he yanked my sleeve up, his thick fingers brushed against the heavy metal ID bracelet strapped tightly to my wrist. I did not resist his grip, but I deliberately turned my arm so he could clearly see the encrypted federal insignia stamped deeply into the titanium steel. The officer froze, his eyes locked onto the bracelet. The room went completely silent as he processed the high-level military clearance codes and the Joint Special Operations Command seal that no civilian was ever supposed to possess. He stared at the cold metal, then slowly looked up into my eyes. All the aggression drained from his face in a fraction of a second. He instantly dropped my arm as if he had been burned. The officer took a large step backward, stood at rigid attention, and snapped a textbook military salute right in the middle of the dining room. "My deepest apologies, ma'am," he said, his voice tight with sudden absolute respect. "I did not realize who you were. How can we assist you today?" Derrick's jaw practically hit the floor. The glass of red wine slipped from his hand and shattered against the hardwood. I did not wait for Derrick to pick his jaw up off the floor. I turned to Jada, grabbed her trembling hand, and walked right past the stunned country club manager. We walked out the mahogany double doors, leaving my husband standing in a puddle of expensive wine and his own shattered ego. The drive back to our sprawling 8,000-square-foot estate in the gated community was dead silent. Jada stared out the window of my SUV, processing the reality of what just happened. When we pulled into the wide circular driveway, I told her to go straight up to her room and lock the door. I knew Derrick would not be far behind us. I walked into the massive chef kitchen and stood by the marble island waiting. I did not have to wait long. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak front door slammed open with enough force to shake the crystal chandelier in the foyer. Derrick's heavy footsteps echoed across the imported tile as he stormed into the kitchen. His tie was ripped off and his designer suit jacket was crumpled in his fist. He threw the jacket onto the counter and pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you are so smart, Valerie," he spat, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "You think flashing some fake veteran sympathy card at a couple of beat cops makes you powerful? I do not know what kind of cheap trick you pulled or who you bribed to get that piece of metal on your wrist, but it does not change a thing." I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest. "I did not bribe anyone, Derrick," I said calmly. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Please. You were a glorified secretary at the VA. You pushed wheelchairs and filed paperwork. Do not stand in my kitchen and try to play the tough military hero. You are completely out of your depth here. This is my world, Valerie. I built an empire of black excellence from the ground up while you sat at home spending my money. I am a titan in this city. I have the mayor on speed dial. I have judges in my pocket. You have absolutely nothing without me." Before I could even formulate a response, the sound of sharp, confident heels clicking against the foyer tiles interrupted us. The front door had not been locked. I watched as Odessa Sterling marched into my kitchen. My mother-in-law was 75 years old, but she carried herself like a ruling monarch. She was draped in a tailored cashmere coat and a silk scarf, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. Trailing right behind her was a tall, thin white man in a sharp gray suit holding a thick leather briefcase. Odessa did not even look at me. She walked straight to Derrick and placed a manicured hand on his arm. "I came as soon as Heather called me," Odessa said, her voice smooth but laced with pure venom. "I told you 15 years ago, Derrick. I told you not to marry beneath your station." She finally turned her cold, piercing eyes toward me. Odessa had always hated me. To her, I was a stain on the Sterling family legacy. I did not come from money. I did not pledge the right sorority. I did not attend a historically black college and university like the rest of her perfectly curated children. I went straight into the military at 18 to escape a broken home. "You always were a stray dog, Valerie," Odessa sneered, taking a step closer to the marble island. "A high school dropout playing soldier while my son built a real estate empire. We let you live in this beautiful home. We let you wear nice clothes and pretend you were one of us. But a stray is always a stray. You bring nothing to this family but embarrassment. And today you crossed a line you can never uncross." I looked at the thin man standing nervously behind her. "And who is this?" I asked, my voice steady. "This is Mr. Vance," Odessa announced proudly. He is the senior partner at the top corporate law firm in the state. He is here to fix the mess you made today. Mr. Vance stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with a sharp click. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents securely bound with a blue ribbon. Derrick crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug now that his mother was here to fight his battles. "You are going to fix this right now," Valerie Odessa commanded. "You embarrassed my son in front of the most important investors in the city. You tried to ruin my granddaughter's financial future. I will not allow you to tear down what this family has built." Odessa snatched the stack of papers from the lawyer and threw it aggressively onto the marble island. The heavy packet slid across the polished stone and stopped right in front of me. It was a post-nuptial agreement. "You will sign away your marital rights tonight, or we will bury you," Odessa threatened, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You will waive all claims to Derricks' companies, his bank accounts, and this estate. In exchange, my son will graciously give you a one-time payment of $50,000 and a bus ticket back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of. If you refuse, Mr. Vance will tie you up in court for the next 10 years. We will drain every cent you have. We will take full custody of Jada, and we will leave you homeless. Sign the paper, Valerie." I looked down at the thick document, then looked up at Derrick, who was grinning like he had already won the war. Then I looked at Odessa, whose chin was raised in absolute arrogant defiance. I could not help it. I started to laugh. It was not a hysterical laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a deep, genuine laugh that bubbled up from my chest. Odessa's face contorted in confusion and rage. Derrick stepped forward, slamming his hand on the counter. "Do you think this is funny?" he roared. "You are about to lose everything." I stopped laughing and let the cold, hard reality of my actual life settle over my features. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. I did not pull out a pen. Instead, I pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. I unfolded it deliberately, smoothing out the creases on the marble countertop right next to their ridiculous post-nuptial agreement. I did not hand it to Derrick. I did not hand it to Odessa. I slid the single sheet of paper directly across the island to Mr. Vance, the high-powered corporate lawyer. Mr. Vance adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down at the document. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the color drain completely out of his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His hands started to visibly shake as he read the federal seals and the notarized signatures at the bottom of the page. "What is it?" Odessa snapped, impatient with the lawyer's sudden silence. "Tell her to sign our contract, Vance." Mr. Vance did not look at Odessa. He slowly raised his head and looked at Derrick with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Sir," the lawyer whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet kitchen. "Sir, you do not own this house. You never did." Derrick snatched the paper out of Mr. Vance's trembling hands. He stared at the crisp black ink and the embossed federal seal at the bottom of the page. His eyes darted wildly across the legal jargon, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. "What kind of garbage is this?" Derrick shouted, waving the paper in the air. "I bought this land 15 years ago. I built this 8,000-square-foot custom estate from the dirt up. My name is on the deed." "Actually, sir, it is not," Mr. Vance said, taking a cautious step back toward the foyer. According to authenticated federal records, the deed was quietly transferred 10 years ago to an entity called Vanguard Tactical Solutions. It is a private defense contracting firm registered directly under the Department of Defense. They hold the title to this entire estate. You signed a blind transfer agreement masked as a corporate tax write-off, Derrick. You legally gave the house away. Odessa slammed her designer handbag onto the marble island. Her face was flushed with heavy indignation. "Fix it, Vance," she commanded, her voice echoing sharply in the large kitchen. "My son pays your firm a ridiculous monthly retainer to handle his real estate portfolio. If there was a clerical error, you march down to the county office tomorrow morning and you correct it. I will not stand here and listen to this absolute nonsense while this woman tries to steal our family home." Mr. Vance adjusted his glasses, sweat forming heavily on his brow. "Mrs. Sterling, you do not understand," he stammered. This is not a simple clerical error. The transfer was completely legal and airtight. It is protected under the National Security Act. I cannot touch it. No civilian court in this state can touch it. Derrick crumpled the paper in his fist. His chest heaved as he turned his furious gaze back to me. "You think you are so clever, Valerie?" he growled, stepping toward me with his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can forge some fake military documents and scare my lawyer? You think a little identity theft is going to save you? You are playing a dangerous game and you are about to lose everything." I ignored his posturing. I calmly turned my back to him and walked over to the custom stainless steel range. I picked up my favorite copper kettle, filled it with filtered water, and set it carefully on the burner. I turned the dial, and the blue gas flame ignited with a soft whoosh. "What are you doing?" Odessa shrieked, deeply offended by my absolute lack of panic. "My son is speaking to you." "I am making a cup of chamomile tea," I said, keeping my back to them. "It has been a very long day, Odessa. You should probably sit down before your blood pressure spikes." Derrick let out a loud, bitter laugh. "Let her make her tea, Mother. Let her enjoy her last night in this kitchen." He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his phone. "You want to play dirty, Valerie? Fine. We will play dirty. Let us see how confident you are when you do not have a single dime to your name to buy groceries tomorrow." He tapped the screen aggressively and put the phone on speaker, setting it down hard on the marble island so I could hear every word. The phone rang twice before a man answered. It was Gregory, the senior wealth manager at the premier private bank Derrick used for all his accounts. Gregory was the man who usually greeted Derrick with a glass of expensive scotch. "Gregory," Derrick barked, leaning over the counter. "I need you to immediately freeze all joint accounts I hold with my wife, Valerie. Then I want you to transfer all liquid assets from my personal checking into my offshore holding account. Cancel all her credit cards right now. Do not ask questions, just do it." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice was trembling just like Mr. Vance. "Derrick, I cannot do that," the banker whispered, sounding utterly terrified. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" Derrick yelled, his authoritative facade starting to heavily crack. "I am your biggest client at that branch. I am telling you to move my money." "Derrick, you do not have any money," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a panicked hush. "Every single account attached to your social security number and corporate tax ID has been completely locked down. The balances are entirely frozen." Derrick stared at the phone, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish out of water. "Frozen," he repeated the word, tasting like poison on his tongue. "What do you mean frozen?" "Unfreeze them, Gregory. Override the system." "I cannot override the federal government," Derrick the banker replied, on the verge of tears. "This is a level 9 federal freeze. The order came directly from the Department of Defense in coordination with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Your accounts are gone, Derrick. They seized the offshore holdings 20 minutes ago. We are legally required to disconnect this call. Goodbye." The line went dead. A hollow dial tone echoed through the massive kitchen. Odessa gripped the edge of the marble island, her knuckles turning completely white. She looked at Derrick, her eyes wide with a deep fear I had never seen in her before. "Derrick, what is happening?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What did you do?" Derrick did not answer her. He was staring at the phone, completely paralyzed. Then slowly, he looked up at me. I stood by the stove, watching the steam begin to rise from the spout of the copper kettle. "You hacked my bank!" Derrick accused, his voice barely above an unhinged whisper. His mind was desperately trying to rationalize the total collapse of his empire. "You got some low-level tech nerd from the VA to hack my bank accounts. This is a felony, Valerie. You are going to federal prison for this. You think you can just press a button and erase my life." I reached into the cabinet and pulled out a delicate porcelain teacup. I placed a chamomile tea bag inside and poured the boiling water, watching the water turn a soft golden hue. I did not look at him while I spoke. "In my line of work, Derrick, we do not hack bank accounts," I said softly, stirring a small spoonful of honey into the cup. "Hacking leaves a digital trail. We do not hack. We seize." We commandeer assets flagged as a critical threat to federal integrity. When you try to steal from a military dependent, the machine moves very quickly. Derrick lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the island. Federal integrity, he yelled, a hysterical edge creeping into his voice. I am a real estate developer. I build luxury condos. What are you talking about? Before I could explain exactly how I had systematically dismantled his fragile empire, his phone lit up again. It was buzzing violently against the marble countertop. The caller ID flashed the name Terrence. Terrence was Derrick's chief financial officer. He was the man who handled all the dirty accounting tricks Derrick used to avoid taxes and inflate his profit margins. Derrick stared at the buzzing phone as if it were a venomous snake. He hesitated for a long second before his shaking fingers swiped the screen to answer. He did not put it on speaker this time, but he did not have to. Terrence was screaming so loudly I could hear every single word across the quiet room. "Derrick, the feds are here!" Terrence shrieked. Agents in tactical gear just kicked in the glass doors to the lobby. They have warrants. They are seizing the servers. They are boxing up the hard drives and barricading the accounting department. Derrick's face turned a sickening shade of gray. "Calm down, Terrence," he pleaded, his voice cracking terribly. "What is the charge? Tell them to wait for my lawyers." "They do not care about your lawyers," Terrence sobbed. Someone handed them a fully documented dossier. They flagged our entire military housing portfolio for federal fraud. They know about the phantom shell companies and the inflated construction costs we billed to the government. They have everything. You are facing 20 years in federal prison, Derrick. They are coming for you next. The phone slipped out of Derrick's sweaty hand and clattered heavily onto the marble island. The call disconnected. The sprawling kitchen was completely silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Odessa was gasping for air, clutching her chest as she sank onto one of the velvet bar stools. Her perfect aristocratic composure was entirely shattered. Mr. Vance, the high-powered corporate lawyer, had silently backed out of the kitchen and was currently sprinting down the driveway, abandoning his client completely. Derrick slowly turned his head. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow. He looked at me with absolute horrified realization. He finally understood that the woman standing in front of him was not a dependent housewife. She was an architect of total destruction. I picked up my porcelain teacup, holding it delicately by the handle. I brought it to my lips and took a slow, warm sip of the chamomile tea. I looked at my husband over the rim of the cup. "I told you not to touch Jada's trust." I left the house the next morning before the federal agents had even finished bagging up Derrick's home office. Jada was safe at my secure location, and I needed exactly one thing: a black coffee from my favorite independent roaster downtown. I walked into the crowded cafe, the heavy scent of roasted espresso washing over me, and took a seat in the back booth facing the door. It was a basic tactical habit ingrained in me from decades of service. I had barely taken my first sip when a pale hand adorned with a massive diamond ring slammed a thick manila envelope onto the small wooden table. I looked up. Heather was standing over me wearing a crisp designer tennis skirt, an expensive cashmere sweater thrown over her shoulders, and an expression of profound manufactured pity. She slid into the booth opposite me, without waiting to be invited, crossing her legs and leaning forward like we were old friends sharing a deep secret. "Valerie, honey, we really need to talk," Heather said, lowering her voice as if we were co-conspirators in some grand scheme. "I saw the local news this morning about Derrick's company, the federal raid, the frozen accounts. It is an absolute tragedy, but let us be brutally honest for a single second. You and I both know you are completely out of your depth here. Derrick is going to bounce back because he has the entire Sterling family machine behind him. Odessa will hire the best defense attorneys in the country. They will twist this entire narrative until you are the villain. They will paint you as a disgruntled, unstable military veteran who sabotaged her wealthy husband because she simply could not handle his massive success. You are going to lose, Jada. You are going to end up sleeping on the streets." Heather reached across the table and tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the heavy manila envelope. I am trying to help you, Valerie. My family, the ones with real generational wealth, not this flashy new money, real estate nonsense. We are very protective of our own. I convinced my father to write a cashier check. $500,000. It is right inside this envelope. Take the money. Heather continued, her tone dripping with toxic sweetness and racial microaggressions. Take Jada and disappear today. Go back to whatever humble little life you had before Derrick rescued you. Buy a nice little house in a neighborhood where you fit in better. You people always talk about wanting peace, right? Well, here is your peace. Take the check before my brother-in-law completely destroys you. Consider it severance pay for putting up with Odessa's attitude all these years. I looked down at the bulging envelope. Then I looked at Heather's perfectly contoured face. She actually believed she was the smartest person in the room. She thought her white savior routine mixed with subtle financial bullying was going to intimidate a woman who had spent years interrogating hostile warlords in secure underground bunkers. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not even flinch. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my encrypted tactical tablet. I set it flat on the table between us and woke up the high-resolution screen. $500,000, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. That is a very generous offer, Heather, especially considering how tightly your father is controlling your trust fund these days. But I am curious. Why are you using your father's money to bribe me when you have been quietly siphoning funds from the Sterling family accounts for the past 3 years? Heather's fake sympathetic smile vanished instantly. Her bright blue eyes darted nervously around the crowded coffee shop, checking to see if anyone was listening to our conversation. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, she hissed, her voice dropping an octave. You are completely delusional. I tapped the screen of my tablet, opening a highly secure forensic accounting file. I turned the device so she could clearly see the neatly organized spreadsheets, banking routing numbers, and highlighted withdrawal dates. The Sterling Family HBCU Scholarship Fund. I read aloud, keeping my cold eyes locked onto her terrified face. An endowment established by Derrick's grandfather to send underprivileged Black students to college. A fund that you graciously volunteered to manage when you married Marcus. It gave you such a wonderful progressive image at all your fancy country club luncheons. Except I continued smoothly swiping to the next page of the detailed dossier. You did not send anyone to college this year, did you, Heather? The money did not go to Howard University or Spelman. It went to a dummy shell corporation registered in Delaware. A corporation that just so happens to be the primary exclusive investor in your younger brother's failing tech startup. He has been burning through cash trying to build a software application that nobody wants, and your wealthy family cut him off completely. So you decided to steal from a Black educational charity to bail out your incompetent white brother. Heather's jaw dropped. All the arrogant color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and panicked. She reached out frantically to grab the tablet, but I smoothly pulled it out of her reach, resting it near my coffee cup. That is a lie, she hissed, her voice trembling violently as panic set in. You forged that document. You cannot prove a single thing. I spent 28 years in military intelligence working with the Joint Special Operations Command. Heather, I replied softly, taking another slow sip of my black coffee. I tracked international arms dealers through offshore accounts that would make your head spin. Finding your sloppy little domestic wire transfers took my cyber team exactly 45 minutes. Marcus will never believe you, she whispered, desperately clutching her designer purse to her chest. He loves me. He knows you are just trying to destroy this family out of pure spite. Marcus is an incredibly proud man, I countered, leaning forward so she could hear every word clearly over the ambient noise of the bustling cafe. He prides himself on his unyielding integrity and his absolute dedication to the Black community. How do you think he is going to react when he finds out his elegant, sophisticated wife has been systematically stealing money meant for disadvantaged kids to fund her brother's useless lifestyle? He will not just divorce you, Heather. He will completely ruin you. Odessa will make sure you never show your face in this elite social circle again. I tapped the screen one final time, opening a pre-drafted encrypted email. The recipient was Marcus Sterling, Attached was the entire unredacted forensic accounting file, including the digital signatures matching her exact home IP address. I pressed send, and a small loading bar appeared on the screen, indicating a delayed delivery sequence. I just scheduled the email to deliver directly to Marcus' personal and work inboxes, I said, my voice ice cold. It hits his server in exactly 10 seconds. Heather let out a pathetic, choked gasp. She lunged across the small wooden table, knocking over her own iced latte in a desperate physical bid to smash the tablet. I easily shifted the device out of her reach, watching her flail helplessly against the wood. 9. I counted aloud, my eyes boring into her panicked soul. 8. 7. Heather scrambled frantically out of the booth, knocking over a chair as she desperately dug through her purse for her own phone, her hands shaking so violently she dropped it onto the floor. 0, I said softly, as Heather's phone hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. A second later, my own phone buzzed on the table. It was the notification, delivery confirmed. Heather dropped to her knees, scrambling to retrieve her device. By the time her trembling fingers unlocked the cracked screen, it was already too late. The Sterling family group chat suddenly exploded. My screen lit up with a rapid-fire stream of notifications. Marcus was the first to reply. He simply forwarded the entire forensic accounting file to the extended family with a single glaring question mark. Then the total chaos erupted. Odessa sent a string of capitalized messages demanding to know exactly why Marcus was sending tax documents on a Tuesday morning. 2 seconds later, Derricks' cousin and auditor for a major accounting firm replied, "Oh my God, she drained the scholarship fund. The money went to Delaware." Heather let out a guttural sob right there on the floor of the coffee shop. Her phone started ringing incessantly. The caller ID flashed Marcus in bold, angry letters. She stared at it, paralyzed by the absolute destruction of her carefully curated, sophisticated life. "You better answer that, Heather," I said, standing up from the booth and grabbing my leather tote bag. "Enjoy your afternoon." I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving her sobbing on the floor. By the time I reached my car, the Sterling family narrative had already begun to frantically shift. Derrick was losing total control of his empire, but he was a master manipulator. He realized that if Heather fell, she would drag him down with her. He needed a scapegoat. He needed the family to focus their collective rage on me. My phone chimed with a mass voice memo sent to every single member of the Sterling family. I connected it to my car's Bluetooth and started the engine. Derrick's voice filled the cabin. He sounded breathless, frantic, but incredibly authoritative. "Do not open any files Valerie sends you," he commanded. "She is having a severe mental breakdown. She forged these documents to divide us. She is a disgruntled, unstable veteran who snapped because I asked for a divorce this morning. She has been secretly hoarding my money, and now she is using illegal military cyber tactics to frame Heather and destroy my companies. We need to stand together as a family. Do not engage with her. I am handling the situation locally." It was a brilliant, desperate move. He was using the very real stigma against combat veterans with post-traumatic stress to paint me as unhinged. He was relying heavily on the Sterling family absolute refusal to air their dirty laundry in public. Within minutes, the busy group chat went dead silent. They were circling the wagons. They were choosing the wealthy son over the outsider wife. They always did. I drove toward the university to pick up Jada. I needed to move her from the temporary safe house to a fully secure luxury location out of state. I pulled into a quiet parking lot and pulled up the booking application for the Grand Marquis Hotel. It was the only luxury hotel in the city with a private underground entrance and independent security contractors. I typed in my information, selected the penthouse suite, and hit confirm. The screen loaded for a moment before a bright red banner appeared. "Booking denied. Please contact the front desk immediately." I frowned. I dialed the concierge directly. A polite young woman answered the phone. "Grand Marquis, how can I help you today?" "This is Valerie Sterling," I said. "I am trying to book the penthouse suite for 2 nights, but the system is blocking my reservation." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The rapid typing stopped. "Mrs. Sterling," the concierge said, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper, I am so incredibly sorry, but we cannot accommodate you. Mr. Sterling called our general manager an hour ago. He said you are involved in a dangerous federal investigation and that your assets are entirely tied up in litigation. He also mentioned that you have a history of violent outbursts. We were strictly instructed by corporate to deny any services to you. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the digital dashboard. Derek was leveraging his massive status in the community. He was calling in every favor using his Black Excellence Country Club network to systematically blacklist me across the board. He was calling restaurants, hotels, and private security firms, branding me as a toxic financial liability. He wanted to trap me in this city with absolutely no resources and no allies. He wanted me to crawl back to him and beg for mercy. "Thank you for your time," I told the concierge and calmly ended the call. I did not panic. I did not scream or hit the steering wheel. I simply smiled. Derek truly thought he controlled the entire board just because he owned a few luxury buildings in one single city. He had absolutely no idea how large the actual board was or who was actually playing the game. I opened my encrypted dialer and typed in a restricted 12-digit sequence. It rang exactly once before a crisp mechanical voice answered the line. "State your authorization code and operational clearance level." Echo Victor Niner. I said, my voice steady and cold. "Clearance level 1. I am requesting the immediate execution of Protocol Delta. Secure transport and extraction for 2 targets. Current GPS location is being transmitted now. Authorization confirmed." "Commander," the voice replied instantly. "ETA is 4 minutes." I dropped the burner phone onto the passenger seat, leaned back against the leather headrest, and waited. Exactly 4 minutes later, the aggressive sound of high-performance engines echoed loudly through the quiet suburban parking lot. 3 massive armored black SUVs with heavily tinted windows and reinforced steel bumpers aggressively pulled into the driveway, boxing my hybrid car perfectly in a highly protective tactical formation. The doors of the lead SUV opened and 2 men in tactical gear stepped out, forming a perimeter. I walked directly into the shielded transport. We drove quickly to the university. Jada was waiting anxiously. She climbed into the back seat looking terrified, but I held her hand, assuring her we were leaving. First, we needed to stop by the estate to retrieve her passport from my safe. The convoy of armored vehicles smoothly navigated the quiet suburban streets, turning onto our residential cul-de-sac. The scene at the estate was chaos. The federal raid was ongoing inside, but Derek and Odessa had been pushed onto the front lawn. Neighbors from surrounding mansions gathered, whispering and pointing fingers. Derrick's facade of black excellence was crumbling publicly. When my tactical convoy pulled into the driveway, all eyes turned toward us. I stepped out, leaving Jada safely secured inside. Derrick saw me, and his eyes lit with desperate fury. He marched toward me, but 2 security contractors crossed their arms, blocking his path. "You have no right to come back here," Derrick shouted, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. "You ruined my life. You are a sociopath." I walked past the barricade, but Odessa stepped into my path. My mother-in-law wore her finest silk lounging outfit, looking out of place on the manicured grass. She looked around at the wealthy neighbors, and her eyes narrowed sharply. Odessa knew exactly how to play the victim. She had weaponized her fragility for decades to control Derek. "Oh, Lord," she wailed loudly, pressing a hand against her forehead in a rehearsed theatrical gesture. "The immense stress, the cruelty of this woman. She is trying to murder me." Odessa let out a dramatic gasp and collapsed onto the concrete driveway. She did not fall hard enough to hurt herself. She gracefully lowered her body, clutching her chest, breathing in rapid, shallow bursts. Derek rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "Mother," he yelled, looking up at me with manufactured rage. "Look what you have done, Valerie. You are giving her a heart attack. Call Dr. Evans right now. Call my concierge doctor." The neighbors gasped. A few pulled out cell phones to record. Odessa lay on the concrete moaning. "Tell Dr. Evans to hurry," she gasped out, rolling her eyes backward. "My heart is failing fast. This vicious woman has broken my heart." Derek frantically dialed his private physician, who would write an exaggerated medical report to use against me. They wanted to create a documented emergency to frame me for elder abuse. They wanted to regain the narrative painting me as an unstable monster who attacked a defenseless elderly black woman. I stood over them looking down at Odessa's perfectly styled hair. I did not flinch. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my encrypted federal radio. I pressed the transmission button. "This is Commander Sterling," I said, projecting clearly over Odessa's fake groans. "I have a medical emergency at my current coordinates. The patient is a 75-year-old female experiencing a severe cardiac event on federally secured property. I am officially overriding civilian medical protocols under the National Security Act. Dispatch a military medevac unit immediately. Priority 1. Derrick froze, holding his phone. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I am calling Dr. Evans. You cannot call the military." "I just did, Derrick," I replied coldly. "This property is owned by Vanguard Tactical Solutions. It is an active federal crime scene. Any civilian medical personnel attempting to cross this perimeter will be arrested for obstruction. Your mother requires the highest level of emergency care, and she is going to get it." Odessa suddenly stopped moaning. Her eyes snapped open, looking at me with genuine fear. "I do not want a military doctor," she snapped momentarily, forgetting she was dying. "I want my personal physician." "Cancel it, Valerie. I cannot cancel a Priority 1 federal medical dispatch." "Odessa," I said, offering a cold, tight smile. "They take cardiac distress very seriously." Less than 3 minutes later, heavy sirens echoed down the street. It was not a standard city ambulance. It was a massive armored tactical medical transport vehicle painted in matte black with stark white federal insignia. It hopped the curb, stopping aggressively on the front lawn, tearing up Derricks' perfectly manicured grass. 4 grim-faced military medics in tactical gear jumped out of the back. They moved with terrifying robotic efficiency. They unrolled a heavy-duty reinforced gurney and marched directly toward Odessa. "Get away from me!" Odessa shrieked, scrambling backward on the concrete. "I am fine. It was just a panic attack. I do not need a hospital." "Ma'am, please remain perfectly still," the lead medic commanded, leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You are experiencing a severe cardiac event. We need to secure you for immediate transport." They grabbed Odessa's arms with firm, unyielding grips. She kicked and screamed, dropping all pretense of her refined, aristocratic status. Derrick tried to intervene, but my security contractors stepped up, shoving him forcefully back onto the grass. He watched in absolute horror as the military medic strapped his mother tightly to the heavy gurney using thick tactical restraints. "You cannot do this," Derrick screamed. "This is kidnapping." "It is a life-saving medical intervention," I corrected him, smoothing down the front of my blazer. "She is in very good hands." The medics hoisted the gurney up, locking the wheels into place. Odessa was hyperventilating for real, her eyes wide with absolute sheer terror, realizing she had completely lost control of her theatrical stunt. I walked up to the side of the gurney as they prepared to load her into the back of the armored medical transport. I leaned down, so my face was only inches from hers. "They are taking you to a federal psychiatric hold for observation." "Odessa!" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the idling engine of the transport vehicle. "Enjoy the hospital food." The heavy doors of the armored medical transport slammed shut, cutting off Odessa's screams. I stepped back as the massive black vehicle tore out of the driveway. Derrick stood frozen, his designer shoes sinking into the ruined mud. He had just watched his worst nightmare unfold. His untouchable mother was gone, and federal agents were still inside, tearing his home office down to the studs. Derrick was a survivor. His panic shifted instantly into raw survival instinct. He sprinted toward his sleek sports car parked on the street, tires squealing as he sped away. I returned to my SUV where Jada was waiting. "We are going for a quick ride," I told her, putting the vehicle into gear. "Your father is about to make a very expensive mistake, and I need to catch him." Derrick was headed straight downtown to the glass skyscraper that housed Sterling Enterprises. Hemorrhaging money with his personal accounts frozen, his only remaining play was corporate liquidation. He had summoned an emergency board meeting, pulling his top-tier investors away from lunches to pitch a frantic asset sell-off. He planned to aggressively dilute his own shares, liquidate his remaining clean commercial properties, and wire the cash offshore before the Department of Defense could freeze the corporate holdings. He thought he was moving faster than the federal government. He had no idea he was already caught in my web. 40 minutes later, I stepped off the private executive elevator on the 50th floor. Two massive private security guards stood outside the frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. They were armed civilian contractors. I walked between them, pushing the heavy glass doors open. The boardroom was incredibly tense. Derricks stood at the head of the mahogany table, sweating profusely through his silk shirt. He was frantically pointing at a financial chart displayed on the digital projector screen, trying to convince 7 wealthy investors to authorize a fire sale of his premium real estate portfolio. Sitting at the opposite end was the lead investor's proxy, a sharp, brilliant black woman named Ms. Hayes, who managed the massive silent fund that kept Derrick's empire afloat. When the doors swung open, Derrick stopped mid-sentence. His eyes locked onto me, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "What in the hell are you doing here?" he shouted. "How did you even get up here?" I walked calmly into the room, my heels clicking sharply. "I am here to attend the emergency board meeting, Derrick," I said, sitting down directly across from him. "I have a vested interest in the outcome." Derrick slammed both hands onto the mahogany table. "Get her out of here," he screamed at the 2 security guards hovering in the doorway. "She is trespassing. Throw her out of my building right now. Use force if you have to." The 2 heavily muscled guards stepped into the room, reaching for their tactical belts. They moved toward me, but I did not stand up. I kept my eyes locked on Derrick. "Stand down." The command came from Ms. Hayes. The proxy sat perfectly still, raising a single manicured hand. The 2 security guards froze instantly, taking a heavy step backward and lowering their hands. They worked for the building management, which was heavily subsidized by Ms. Hayes' investment group. "What are you doing?" Derrick sputtered, turning to the proxy. "She is my estranged wife. She is having a mental breakdown. You cannot let her hijack a closed executive session. We are talking about millions of dollars here." Ms. Hayes adjusted her stylish glasses, looking at Derrick with cold disdain. "We are talking about federal fraud, Mr. Sterling," she corrected him, her voice smooth and lethal. "We are talking about the Department of Defense raiding your residential properties, while you stand here begging us for a cash bailout. I think I would very much like to hear what this woman has to say." Ms. Hayes gestured respectfully toward me. "The floor is yours." Derrick looked like he was going to vomit. I stood up and walked over to the digital podium. I pulled a small encrypted titanium flash drive from my pocket, inserting it directly into the main console. I typed a 16-character alphanumeric sequence, bypassing Derrick's weak corporate firewall in seconds. The projector screen behind him flickered black, then violently flashed back to life, displaying a massive, highly complex web of financial routing numbers, offshore accounts, and federal tax identification codes. "What you are looking at is the true financial architecture of Sterling Enterprises," I said, projecting my voice clearly. 15 years ago, Derrick Sterling did not build this company with his own business acumen. He was facing bankruptcy. He was bailed out by a massive anonymous capital injection from a shadow LLC registered in Delaware. That LLC has been silently funding his entire real estate portfolio, keeping his margins artificially inflated so he could parade around town as a self-made titan of industry. Derrick laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "You are insane, Valerie," he spat, pointing at the screen. "My angel investor is completely anonymous. When they find out you are hacking their proprietary financial data, they will bury you under lawsuits. They own me and they own this building." I did not argue with him. I tapped the screen, bringing up the master incorporation document for the Shadow LLC. I magnified the bottom right corner of the document, projecting the legally binding signature across the massive screen for everyone to see. It was a digital signature authenticated by a military cryptographic key, Valerie Sterling. Derrick stared at this massive signature on the wall. His eyes darted rapidly from the screen to my face and back again, trying to force his brain to process an absolute impossibility. The room was dead silent. "You," he whispered, all the breath leaving his lungs. "You cannot be the investor. You did not have any money. You were a desk clerk." At that exact moment, Ms. Hayes, the powerful proxy who controlled the boardroom, stood up from her leather chair. She did not look at Derrick. She turned her entire body toward me, snapped her heels together, and stood at rigid attention. "Awaiting your orders, Commander," she said, her voice ringing with absolute military precision. Derrick collapsed backward into his chair, staring at me in absolute horrified realization as the truth finally crushed the very last breath out of his lungs. I was the Shadow LLC. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos, but Ms. Hayes maintained perfect order. She calmly instructed the building security to escort Derrick out of the facility immediately. He did not fight back or shout. He looked completely hollowed out, like a man whose entire fabricated reality had just evaporated into thin air. 2 armed civilian guards flanked him, lifting him by his tailored shoulders and marching him out of his own corporate headquarters. I spent the next 4 hours with Ms. Hayes and the remaining board members, legally transferring every clean asset back into Vanguard Tactical Solutions. By the time I finally left the skyscraper, the sun was setting over the city, and my phone was entirely silent. I knew Derrick better than he knew himself. A narcissist, stripped of his wealth and public adoration, does not simply surrender and accept defeat. They lash out violently. They burn the house down to ensure nobody else can live in it. Derrick was completely out of legal and financial options, so I knew his next move would be strictly criminal. He needed the physical master ledger. It was an encrypted solid-state drive I kept in the estate floor safe that contained the original Vanguard Incorporation keys and the offshore routing numbers. He mistakenly believed that if he could physically destroy that drive, he could claim the digital transfers were fraudulent and tie the estate up in probate court for years. It was a stupid, desperate plan, but desperate men do stupid things. When I returned to the estate, the federal agents had finished their preliminary raid and cleared out, leaving the massive house eerily quiet. I immediately contacted my extraction team and had Jada moved to a secondary secure location 3 states away under armed guard. Once I confirmed my daughter was perfectly safe, I walked through the sprawling 8,000-square-foot house, locking the reinforced doors and drawing the heavy blackout curtains. I changed out of my tailored business suit and slipped into tactical cargo pants, a moisture-wicking black shirt, and a pair of silent combat boots. Then I went down to the basement armory to prepare the battlefield. Across town, Derrick was executing his final desperate play. He put on a custom-tailored tuxedo and attended the highly publicized annual Black Excellence Charity Gala at the downtown museum. It was a perfectly calculated alibi. He wanted to be photographed, shaking hands with the mayor and sipping expensive champagne while his hired muscle did the dirty work. He was sweating through his suit, smiling tightly as wealthy elites whispered about the FBI raid on his offices. He played the victim perfectly, telling everyone it was a massive misunderstanding, fueled by an unstable, vengeful wife. But he kept checking his phone, waiting for the confirmation text that his problem had been permanently erased. He had reached deep into the criminal underworld, utilizing his shady construction contacts to hire a crew of 4 disgraced ex-mercenaries. These were men who had been dishonorably discharged for extreme violence and now worked as high-priced thugs for desperate corporate executives. Derrick paid them with the last stash of untraceable physical cash he had hidden in a storage unit. Their orders were incredibly simple. Break into the estate, terrify the middle-aged housewife into opening the vault, take the master ledger, and burn the house to the ground. At exactly 11 o'clock at night, the power to the entire estate was abruptly cut. The massive crystal chandeliers went completely dark. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning died instantly, leaving the house in suffocating, heavy silence. The backup generator did not kick on because I had personally disconnected the fuel line an hour earlier. I wanted them in the dark. I stood in the center of the massive chef kitchen, completely motionless, controlling my breathing. I heard the faint crunch of gravel outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were moving sloppily, relying on brute force rather than stealth. They assumed they were dealing with a terrified suburban wife who would be hiding under the bed crying for her husband. They had no idea they were walking into a fatal funnel designed by a Joint Special Operations Command logistics expert. I did not see my house as a home anymore. I saw it as a tactical grid filled with choke points and kill zones. A heavily suppressed gunshot shattered the reinforced glass of the back patio door. A gloved hand reached through the jagged hole and unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy door swung open and 4 large men dressed in dark tactical gear stepped into the living room. They were heavily armed, carrying suppressed submachine guns and tactical flashlights. The beams of their lights swept wildly across the imported Italian leather sofas and the expensive abstract artwork. "Clear the first floor," the lead thug whispered harshly, his rough voice carrying easily through the quiet house. "Find the woman. Break a few of her fingers if you have to, but get the vault code before you torch the place. Make it hurt so she does not try to lie to us." They split up, moving through the shadows with the arrogant confidence of predators who believed they were hunting incredibly easy prey. 2 of them headed toward the grand staircase, while the lead thug and the 4th man moved slowly toward the kitchen. Their flashlight beams danced across the polished marble floors, slicing through the heavy darkness. I remained perfectly still, crouching in the blind spot above the custom mahogany cabinets near the ceiling. I had utilized a chimney climbing technique to wedge myself into the architectural alcove directly above the commercial refrigerator, giving me a perfect, unobstructed aerial view of the entire room. The lead mercenary stepped cautiously into the pitch-black kitchen, his heavy boots squeaking faintly against the marble. He swept his flashlight across the empty island over the copper kettle still sitting on the stove and past the walk-in pantry. The room appeared completely deserted. He signaled his partner to check the formal dining room, leaving him completely alone in the center of the kitchen. He lowered his weapon slightly, reaching up to tap his radio earpiece. "The kitchen is empty," he muttered, sounding annoyed. "Check the master suite upstairs. She has to be cowering in a closet somewhere." He stood in the darkness, completely unaware that death was suspended exactly 8 feet above his head. I did not reach for a firearm. A gunshot would end this far too quickly, and I needed these men alive to testify against my husband in federal court. I reached into my tactical vest and pulled down my specialized optical equipment. The lead thug took one more heavy step toward the refrigerator, putting himself directly beneath my perch. In the absolute suffocating silence of the dark kitchen, the mercenary suddenly froze. His shoulders tensed as he heard a sharp, distinct sound directly above him. It was a sound that every combat veteran recognized with bone-chilling clarity. It was the unmistakable mechanical click of quad-tube night vision goggles powering on. Before he could even process the sound of the optics activating, I dropped from the ceiling alcove. 28 years of muscle memory took over instantly. I did not fall clumsily. I used the momentum of gravity to drive my knee directly into his upper spine, just between his shoulder blades, while my left arm wrapped tightly around his throat. We hit the polished marble floor together, but I absorbed the impact, rolling him violently forward. Before he could raise his suppressed weapon or scream, I applied 30 pounds of focused pressure to his carotid artery. His brain was deprived of oxygen in less than 4 seconds. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his body went completely limp. I guided him silently to the floor, taking his radio earpiece and slipping it into my own ear. One down. The voice of his partner crackled through the stolen earpiece. "Hey boss, the dining room is clear. Nothing in here but some expensive china. I am heading back your way." I moved out of the kitchen, slipping through the heavy shadows with the absolute silence of a ghost. The green hue of my night vision goggles illuminated the dining room doorway. The second mercenary was walking backwards, sweeping his flashlight across the hallway walls. He never checked his 6 o'clock blind spot. I stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar and grabbed the barrel of his submachine gun, twisting it sharply upward to break his trigger finger. He let out a muffled gasp of pain, but I was already moving inside his guard. I delivered a devastating palm strike to his solar plexus, driving the air completely out of his lungs. As he folded forward, gasping for oxygen, I swept his legs out from under him. His head bounced hard against the thick Persian rug, knocking him unconscious before he even realized he was under attack. I secured his wrists and ankles with heavy-duty zip ties in less than 5 seconds. 2 left. The radio crackled again, This was the pair heading up the grand staircase. "Boss, we are on the second floor. Master bedroom is empty. The safe is not here. Should we start smashing the walls?" I did not reply. I unclipped a small spool of high-tensile microwire from my tactical vest. I moved rapidly up the secondary servant stairs, bypassing the main foyer entirely. I reached the second-floor landing before they even finished searching my closet. I quickly strung the wire across the top of the grand staircase, anchoring it to the heavy oak banisters at exact shin height. Then I retreated into the shadows of the hallway and waited. The two remaining mercenaries stomped out of the master suite, clearly frustrated by their lack of progress. Their flashlight beams bounced aggressively off the family portraits lining the walls. "This is a waste of time," one of them muttered heavily. "Let us just torch the place and tell Sterling the safe was empty. He is not going to know the difference anyway." They moved toward the top of the stairs side by side, completely abandoning basic tactical spacing. The man on the right hit the microwire first. His forward momentum carried his upper body over the trap, while his legs were instantly anchored. He pitched forward with a violent curse, tumbling head-first down the carpeted stairs in a chaotic tangle of limbs and tactical gear. His partner spun around in shock, raising his weapon toward the staircase. He left his flank completely exposed. I stepped out of the darkness, closing the distance in 2 massive strides. I grabbed his tactical vest, pulling him violently forward while driving my elbow directly into his jawline. The bone cracked loudly, echoing through the quiet house. He dropped his weapon, clutching his face in agony. I spun behind him, kicking the back of his knee to force him down, and locked him into a textbook rear-naked choke. He thrashed wildly for a few seconds, throwing blind elbows backward, but my grip was like industrial steel. He faded into unconsciousness and slumped onto the floor. I dragged him down the stairs by his tactical harness, tossing him directly on top of his groaning partner, who was nursing a dislocated shoulder at the bottom of the landing. The entire engagement took exactly 1 minute and 48 seconds. I dragged all 4 massive men into the center of the living room, lining them up face down on the imported Italian rug. I secured their wrists and ankles with industrial-grade zip ties, chaining them together so they could not leverage their weight. I systematically stripped them of their weapons, tactical knives, and communication gear, tossing the hardware into a useless pile by the fireplace. Finally, I pulled off my night vision goggles and walked over to the electrical panel in the hallway, flipping the main breaker back on. The crystal chandeliers flooded the room with blinding light. The lead thug groaned heavily, blinking against the sudden brightness as he slowly regained consciousness. He looked around in absolute confusion, seeing his entire heavily armed crew hogtied on the floor. He tried to thrash against the thick plastic restraints, but quickly realized it was entirely useless. He looked up at me, standing calmly over him, with my arms crossed over my chest. "You are making a massive mistake, lady," he growled, trying to project a tough exterior, despite bleeding profusely from his nose. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." I reached into his tactical vest and pulled out his encrypted smartphone. "Actually, I know exactly who I am dealing with," I replied, pressing his thumb against the biometric scanner to unlock the device. "I know Derricks Sterling is too much of a coward to do his own dirty work. He hired you because you were cheap and desperate. Now you are going to federal prison for armed home invasion." I opened his recent files. These men were amateur street thugs playing dress-up. They did not use secure military channels. They used a standard audio recording application to secretly record their initial meeting with Derrick, ensuring they had blackmail material if he ever refused to pay them. I found the file labeled Sterling Contract and forwarded the pristine audio recording directly to my own secure server. The evidence was absolutely flawless. Derrick explicitly ordering the destruction of the property and demanding the physical master ledger. Across town, Derrick was standing in the center of the downtown museum ballroom. The charity gala was in full swing. He was holding a flute of expensive champagne, smiling broadly as he engaged in polite conversation with the city councilman. He was wearing his perfectly tailored tuxedo, playing the role of the tragic but resilient titan of industry. He felt entirely untouchable. He believed he was exactly 10 minutes away from a phone call confirming his problems had been burned to ashes. He felt his phone vibrate in his breast pocket. He excused himself from the councilman with a charming smile and stepped into a quiet alcove near the restrooms. He eagerly pulled the device out, expecting a text message reading, "Job done." Instead, his screen illuminated with an incoming video call from an unknown restricted number. Frowning, he answered it. The screen flickered and resolved into a crystal-clear, high-definition live feed. Derricks stopped breathing. He dropped his champagne flute. The expensive crystal shattered against the marble floor, but he did not even flinch. He was staring directly at his own living room. He saw his 4 highly paid, heavily armed mercenaries bound together on the floor, looking bruised, bloody, and utterly terrified. The camera panned up slowly, revealing my face. I was standing over the men, looking directly into the lens. In my right hand, I was casually holding the original signed contract he had tried to force Jada to sign back at the country club. I did not raise my voice. I did not look angry. I looked perfectly at peace. "Your 15 minutes are up, Derrick," I said quietly through the phone. "See you in federal court." The screen went black. Derrick stood in the quiet alcove of the museum ballroom, staring at his reflection in the darkened glass of his smartphone. The classical music from the charity gala drifted through the arched hallway, but he could barely hear it over the sound of his own pulse pounding violently in his ears. The mercenaries were supposed to be his ultimate failsafe. They were violent professionals, and she had dismantled them without a single scratch. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he could not fight Valerie on a tactical level. She was a ghost who had spent nearly 3 decades mastering the art of asymmetric warfare. But Derrick was a narcissist, and a narcissist always believes they have one final card to play. If he could not break the mother, he would shatter the daughter. He needed a hostage, not a physical one, but a legal one. If he could force Jada to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, combined with a public statement of support, he could muddy the waters enough to cast doubt on Valerie and delay the federal indictments. He bolted from the downtown museum, leaving his champagne soaking into the imported marble floor. By 8 o'clock the next morning, he was standing in the center of the bustling university courtyard. He tracked Jada's location through a family tracking application she forgot to disable on her smartwatch. He did not come alone. Flanking him were 2 junior associates from a high-priced crisis management law firm. They wore sharp, dark suits, carrying sleek leather briefcases, chosen to look highly intimidating to a college student. Derrick smoothed his tailored jacket, checking his reflection in the campus library glass doors. He needed to be incredibly swift and completely ruthless before Valerie realized her daughter was no longer at the secure safe house. Jada had insisted on attending her morning seminar to maintain some sense of normalcy, and Derrick had capitalized on that singular mistake. Jada walked out of the science building, clutching a heavy stack of textbooks to her chest. She looked completely exhausted, her shoulders slumped from the immense stress of the past 24 hours. Derrick stepped directly into her path, blocking the narrow concrete walkway. Jada stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes widening in immediate alarm. The 2 corporate lawyers moved swiftly to flank her, cutting off any potential escape routes across the manicured lawn. Derrick flashed a warm, paternal smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Hello, Jada," he said, his voice projecting loudly enough for passing students to hear. "We need to have a quick family discussion." Jada clutched her books tighter, taking a defensive step backward. "I have nothing to say to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Mom told me you would try to corner me. I am going to class." Derrick laughed, a short, dismissive sound explicitly designed to make her look like an emotional child in public. "Do not be dramatic, Jada," he scolded, stepping closer to invade her personal space. "Your mother is going through a very severe mental health crisis right now. She is confused and deeply paranoid. She is destroying the family legacy that I built solely for you. I am here to protect your future before she burns it all to the ground." One of the lawyers unclipped a sleek silver pen and held it out along with a thick stack of legal documents resting on a heavy leather clipboard. "This is a standard non-disclosure and family unity agreement," the lawyer said smoothly. "It simply states that you support your father and will not speak to the press or federal authorities regarding your mother's baseless financial allegations. Sign it right here, and we can all go home peacefully." Jada looked at the heavy clipboard, and then up at the man who had raised her. She saw the absolute desperation leaking through his highly polished facade. She remembered the way her mother had stood perfectly still in the country club, tearing his empire apart piece by piece, without raising her voice. A sudden wave of intense clarity washed over her. The trembling in her hands completely vanished. She did not reach for the silver pen. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a chilling calmness she had definitely inherited from Valerie. "You are not trying to protect my future, Jada," said her voice ringing out clearly across the crowded courtyard. "You are trying to use me as a human shield because the federal government finally caught you stealing." Derrick dropped the warm smile, his jaw clenching tight. "Lower your voice," he hissed, glancing nervously at the college students who were beginning to stop and stare at the escalating confrontation. "Do not disrespect me in public. I gave you everything. I paid for this expensive school. I showed up for you." "Showed up," Jada shot back, stepping forward instead of retreating. "You did not come to my high school graduation to celebrate my achievements, Derrick. You came to network with the dean of admissions because you wanted a commercial contract to build the new athletic center. You sat in the front row checking emails on your phone the entire ceremony, and you left before they even handed me my diploma. You never cared about me. You only cared about how my accomplishments made you look at your elite country club. I am not signing anything." She shoved past the junior lawyer, knocking the expensive silver pen out of his hand. It clattered loudly against the concrete walkway. Derrick's fragile ego shattered completely. Being defied by his wife was one thing, but being publicly humiliated by the daughter he viewed as his own personal property pushed him over the edge into pure, uncontrolled rage. He lunged forward and violently grabbed Jada's upper arm, his thick fingers digging painfully into her skin. He yanked her backward with enough force to make her drop her heavy textbooks. The book slammed onto the pavement, scattering across the walkway. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat!" He snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and angry. "You are going to sign this paper right now, or I swear to God I will cut you off completely. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." Jada gasped in sharp pain, trying to wrench her arm free, but his physical grip was like an industrial vice. The two corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing they were aiding a physical assault in broad daylight on a crowded college campus. Derrick raised his other hand, preparing to grab her shoulder and physically force her down toward the clipboard. Before his hand could make contact, a brilliant ruby-red laser dot suddenly appeared perfectly centered on Derrick's tailored chest, resting exactly over his heart. Derrick froze completely. He looked down at his shirt, staring in absolute horror at the glowing red dot. The busy courtyard went completely dead silent as students backed away in terror. The distinct sound of heavy tactical boots crunching aggressively against the pavement echoed from the shaded archway of the campus library. Valerie stepped out of the shadows of the courtyard wearing a dark tactical jacket and holding a suppressed compact sidearm perfectly leveled with both hands. "Let him go, Derrick!" I commanded, my voice echoing off the concrete walls of the campus library. I did not shout. I did not have to. The suppressed barrel of my sidearm remained perfectly steady, locked directly onto the center of his chest. Derrick froze completely. He looked from the glowing red dot on his expensive suit jacket to my cold, unwavering eyes. His two corporate lawyers immediately threw their hands up and scrambled backward, desperate to distance themselves. "You are insane," Derrick whispered, his voice trembling as he slowly released his vice, like grip on Jada's arm. "You brought a weapon to a university. I will have you locked in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your life." I lowered the weapon, engaging the safety and sliding it seamlessly into a concealed holster beneath my jacket. The red dot vanished from his chest. "I did not bring a weapon to a university, Derrick," I replied calmly, closing the distance between us. "I am a federally authorized defense contractor operating under an active high-risk extraction mandate. If you ever place your hands on my daughter again, I will not bother turning the laser on." Jada ran to my side, trembling violently. I wrapped one arm securely around her shoulders, keeping my eyes locked onto Derrick. He stood there, utterly powerless, watching his primary leverage slip away. The students in the courtyard were staring, whispering rapidly to one another. Derrick turned sharply, adjusting his jacket in a pathetic attempt to regain his dignity. He motioned for his lawyers to follow him and power walked toward his sports car. I escorted Jada to the armored transport vehicle waiting on the edge of campus. We drove directly to our secure secondary location outside the city limits. It was managed by military contractors loyal only to Vanguard. Derrick was out of physical options and had no access to corporate funds. But a narcissist backed into a corner will always resort to the only currency left: public perception. By 5 o'clock, the retaliation hit. It did not come in the form of a legal injunction or a physical attack. It came through the television screen. Jada was sitting on the leather sofa scrolling through her phone when she suddenly gasped, dropping the device onto the coffee table. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice thick with panic. "Turn on the local news." I picked up the remote control and turned on the flat screen mounted on the wall. Derrick had orchestrated a masterclass in public manipulation. He sat on the set of the most prominent local news network in the state. He was being interviewed by a highly respected journalist known for championing Black entrepreneurship. He wore a subdued gray sweater, looking exhausted, heartbroken, and incredibly vulnerable. "It is the tragedy of war," Derrick said, looking into the camera with manufactured tears. "My wife Valerie served her country for 28 years. I have always been incredibly proud of her service. But the transition back to civilian life has completely broken her. She is suffering from severe paranoia and untreated trauma." "And this crisis led to the lockdown of Sterling Enterprises?" the journalist asked. "Yes," Derrick lied flawlessly, wiping a single tear from his cheek. "She became convinced the government was trying to steal my companies. In her delusional state, she utilized old military connections to illegally freeze my corporate accounts, holding my entire business hostage. She is destroying the legacy I built for our community and even threatened our daughter today. I am begging anyone to help me get my wife the psychiatric intervention she desperately needs before she hurts someone." The broadcast cut to a large photo of me. It was a grainy image making me look angry and dangerous. Below the photo, the news ticker rolled across the screen. "Prominent real estate titan pleads for help as unstable veteran wife hijacks empire." The smear campaign was perfection. Derrick weaponized the stigma of military trauma to invalidate me. By casting himself as the supportive husband, he insulated himself from the impending federal fraud charges. The public would assume any indictment was just my deranged sabotage. The social fallout was instantaneous and devastating. Jada's phone began to ring endlessly. Her friends and cousins were texting her asking if she was safe. The elite African-American community universally rallied behind Derrick. He was their golden boy. He was the pillar of the community who built affordable housing and funded scholarships. They accepted the narrative that the quiet outsider wife had snapped. Social media flooded with posts praising Derrick's strength and offering prayers. Jada pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the people she had known turn against us. "They believe him," Jada cried, her voice cracking under the weight of the massive betrayal. "The whole city thinks you are crazy, Mom. He has everyone on his side. He controls the entire narrative." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with absolute despair. "How do we fight the entire city?" I did not offer empty reassurances. I walked over to my tactical workstation. I flipped open the lid of my encrypted military-grade laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating my calm, focused expression. "Derrick thinks public relations is the same thing as power," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the panic in the room like a surgical blade. "He thinks controlling the local news cycle is going to save him from a federal indictment. He is playing a civilian game." I typed in my master authorization sequence, unlocking the restricted servers of Vanguard Tactical Solutions. I accessed the massive digital archive I had compiled, containing pristine audio recordings, offshore routing numbers, and explicitly illegal contracts bearing Derrick's digital signature. "They want to play with the media," I said softly, looking at Jada as my finger hovered over the keyboard. Let us show them what real intelligence gathering looks like. I hit enter. The keystroke sent an encrypted data packet bouncing through 3 secure offshore servers before it simultaneously flooded the inbox of every major news outlet in the state. I did not just send it to the media. I targeted the private emails of the Oakridge Country Club Board of Directors, the city council members, the mayor, and every single investor attached to Sterling Enterprises. The file was a meticulously organized masterpiece of absolute destruction. It contained high-definition audio recordings of Derricks sitting in his mahogany office laughing about bribing the city zoning commissioner. It held the unredacted digital ledgers proving he had been dodging federal taxes for a decade by funneling money through fake charitable foundations. But the most damaging file was a simple voice memo. It was Derricks speaking to his white contractors, mocking the very African-American community he claimed to uplift. He called his affordable housing projects a gold mine built for gullible fools and bragged about using his black excellence persona as a bulletproof shield to scam the city out of millions. He laughed about how easily he manipulated the local church leaders into endorsing his fraudulent building developments. The fallout was not gradual. It was a sudden, catastrophic implosion. Across the city, smartphones began to buzz and chime simultaneously as journalists and politicians opened the encrypted links. Derrick was walking out of the local television studio feeling incredibly arrogant after his flawless victim performance when his device started vibrating violently in his pocket. He answered the first call with a smug, confident smile, assuming it was a congratulatory message from a wealthy friend. Instead, it was the president of the Oakridge Country Club. The older man did not mince words. He informed Derrick that his exclusive membership was permanently revoked, effective immediately, and armed security would physically remove him if he ever stepped foot on the property again. Before Derrick could even ask what happened, the line went dead. Then the second call came. It was the mayor. The same mayor who had smiled and drank expensive champagne with him at the charity gala just the night before. The mayor screamed into the phone, demanding to know if the leaked audio recordings were real. He did not wait for an answer. He informed Derrick that the city was immediately freezing all municipal contracts with Sterling Enterprises to legally distance the administration from the impending federal indictment. Derrick tried to speak, but the mayor hung up on him. Derrick stood in the hot television studio parking lot, staring at his phone as the notifications multiplied like a deadly virus. Investors were sending rapid-fire emails pulling their capital commitments. High-profile defense lawyers were sending formal legal notices, withdrawing their representation, stating a severe conflict of interest. He frantically dialed his chief financial officer, hoping Terrence could somehow spin the financial data, but the number was completely disconnected. Terrence had already taken a plea deal. Derrick dropped his expensive leather briefcase onto the concrete, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his smartphone. Back at the safe house, Jada and I sat in front of the television, watching the exact same news network that had just painted me as a deranged, paranoid veteran. The anchor, who had nodded sympathetically at Derrick's calculated lies only 10 minutes ago, was now touching her earpiece with a visibly shocked expression. Breaking news flashed across the screen, replacing my grainy photograph with a bright red emergency banner. The anchor announced that a massive leak of verified financial documents and audio recordings had just exposed Derrick Sterling as the center of a massive federal corruption scandal. They played the audio of Derrick mocking the community live on the air. His cruel, arrogant laughter echoed out of our television speakers. Jada covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. She watched her father's untouchable reputation turn to ash in a matter of seconds. Her phone, which had been filled with hateful messages just moments ago, suddenly began buzzing with apologies. The same people who had called me crazy were now publicly condemning Derrick on every social media platform. The elite African-American community that he had used as a social shield turned on him with terrifying speed. They realized they had been played for fools by a man who secretly despised them. The local news cut to live footage of angry protesters already gathering outside the Sterling Enterprises downtown skyscraper, holding signs demanding federal prison time for the fraudulent real estate developer. Jada leaned against my shoulder, letting out a long, trembling breath. The heavy burden of fear she had carried all morning finally lifted. Derrick was completely isolated. He had manipulated the city for years, but he forgot that loyalty bought with money vanishes the exact second the money disappears. His own family was already scrambling frantically to survive the blast radius of his total collapse. My laptop chimed loudly with a new automated alert. I had set up a digital tracking algorithm for any media mentions of the Sterling family name. I clicked the link opening a live video feed of a highly popular local podcast known for interviewing the wealthy elite. The host was sitting at a sleek studio desk. Sitting directly across from him, looking entirely panicked but perfectly made up, was Heather. My arrogant white sister-in-law had seen the sinking ship and decided to secure the only available lifeboat. Heather stared directly into the podcast studio cameras, wiping away a fake tear with a tissue. She publicly claimed she was a terrified, helpless victim of Derrick's severe psychological manipulation. She told the host that Derrick had aggressively forced her to embezzle the money from the family scholarship fund to cover his own illegal tracks. She looked directly into the camera and threw the man who had funded her luxurious lifestyle entirely under the bus in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save her own skin. I reached out and gently closed the lid of my encrypted laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet living room of our secure safe house. Jada sat beside me, her eyes wide as she processed the absolute speed of the destruction. We did not need to fire another shot. The Sterling family was a house of cards built entirely on a foundation of greed and fragile egos. Now that the money was gone and the federal spotlight was blindingly bright, they were doing exactly what rats do when a ship begins to sink. They were eating each other alive. Across town, the matriarch of the Sterling family was executing her own desperate survival strategy. Odessa had been released from her 24-hour federal psychiatric observation, completely humiliated, but entirely lucid. Her phone was blowing up, not with well wishes, but with polite dismissals from the elite social circles she had ruled for decades. Her country club friends were distancing themselves. The board of her favorite charities asked her to step down immediately. Odessa realized that her association with Derrick was absolute social poison. She did not hesitate to cut the cord. She arranged a highly publicized interview with a prominent local magazine, standing on the steps of her sprawling estate, which she had just learned she no longer owned. She wore a dark, mournful dress and spoke with trembling lips. She publicly disowned her eldest son, claiming she had been completely blinded by a mother's love and had no idea about his horrific financial crimes. She stated Derrick had strayed too far from the righteous path of the Sterling ancestors and that she stood with the community in condemning his actions. She threw him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, just to maintain her standing at her weekly high society luncheons. Derrick saw his mother's betrayal on a television screen mounted above the bar of a dingy downtown hotel, where he had been forced to rent a room after his credit cards were frozen. He stared at the screen, his face twisting into a mask of pure feral rage. His mother had abandoned him. His investors had ruined him. But when his phone buzzed with an alert about Heather's podcast interview, his anger found a specific physical target. He knew exactly where his arrogant sister-in-law would be hiding. Heather was sitting on the outdoor patio of an upscale French bistro, desperately trying to salvage her reputation over expensive salads with two wealthy friends from her side of the family. She was wearing designer sunglasses and speaking rapidly, trying to play the fragile victim. She never saw Derrick coming until he violently kicked the wrought iron gate of the patio open. He marched directly to her table, his tailored suit wrinkled and stained, his eyes bloodshot and unhinged. The wealthy patrons of the bistro gasped as Derrick slammed both of his heavy hands down onto Heather's table, shattering a delicate porcelain plate. "You lying parasite!" Derrick roared, his voice booming across the crowded patio. You go on a podcast and tell the city I forced you to steal. You drained that scholarship fund to bail out your pathetic brother, and you begged me to help you hide the wire transfers. Heather scrambled backward in her chair, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose. Her friends instantly stood up, backing away from the table in horror. "Get away from me, Derrick!" Heather shrieked, her carefully cultivated, sophisticated accent completely vanishing. "You are a federal criminal. You manipulated this entire family. You are going to prison for the rest of your life, and you are not dragging me down with you." Derrick lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the table and flipping it violently. Glasses of iced tea and expensive salads crashed onto the concrete. "You think your white privilege is going to save you?" Derrick screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at her face. "I have the receipts, Heather. I have the emails you sent me begging for offshore routing numbers. If I am going down, you are going right into the cell next to me." Heather grabbed her heavy designer purse and swung it wildly, hitting Derrick squarely in the jaw. He stumbled back, shouting obscenities, while Heather screamed for the restaurant manager to call the police. Almost instantly, a dozen smartphones shot up into the air. Diners on the patio and pedestrians on the sidewalk were recording every single second of the vicious public brawl. The golden boy of black excellence and his sophisticated, wealthy sister-in-law were literally fighting in the dirt, screaming about federal wire fraud and embezzlement for the entire world to see. Within 10 minutes, the video was trending globally. I sat on the sofa with Jada, watching the raw footage play out on a news aggregate site. Jada let out a breath she had been holding for years. "They are monsters," she whispered, watching her aunt and her father tear each other to shreds. "They always were, Jada," I replied softly, pouring us both a glass of cold water. "They just finally ran out of victims, so they turned their teeth on each other." Derrick did not wait for the police to arrive at the bistro. He fled the scene, driving erratically back to his cheap downtown motel room. He locked the flimsy door, pacing the stained carpet like a rabid dog. His phone was completely dead. His family had publicly crucified him. His empire was seized. He was completely trapped. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed against the motel room door. Derrick froze. The knock came again, harder this time. "Mr. Sterling," a stern voice called out from the hallway. "Federal courier, open the door." Derrick slowly turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A man in a dark suit handed him a thick manila envelope sealed with red federal tape. The courier did not say another word, simply turning and walking down the dingy hallway. Derrick closed the door and tore the envelope open. It was exactly what he had been dreading. A federal summons. He was being officially indicted by the United States Department of Justice for 22 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. His initial court appearance was scheduled for the following morning. The weight of the federal government was finally crashing down on his head. He stared at the indictment, his breathing shallow and rapid. But then a strange, twisted expression crossed his face. The pure panic slowly morphed into a dark, chilling smile. His narcissistic delusion was a powerful drug refusing to let him accept defeat. He walked over to his leather briefcase, which he had grabbed from his office just before the raid. He popped the combination locks and reached deep beneath the silk lining, pulling out a hidden, heavily secured folder. He opened the folder and stared at the crisp document inside. It was a prenuptial agreement bearing a perfect, flawless forgery of my signature and a bribed notary stamp. According to this document, I had explicitly signed away all rights to Vanguard Tactical Solutions and admitted to acting solely as his administrative proxy. He genuinely believed this piece of paper was his ultimate trump card. He believed he was going to walk into federal court, frame me as the mastermind, and walk out a free man. He ran his thumb over the forged signature, his smile growing wider in the dim motel room. "Let us see how smart you really are, Valerie," he whispered to the empty room. The next morning arrived with a biting chill in the air, setting the perfect stage for the final act of Derrick's delusion. I walked up the wide, concrete steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, my posture perfectly straight. The plaza was an absolute circus. News vans were parked illegally on the sidewalks, and reporters were shouting questions aggressively over the heavy police barricades. They wanted to see the disgraced real estate titan. They wanted a glimpse of the unstable veteran wife he had claimed was ruining his life. I completely ignored the flashing cameras walking through the heavy revolving doors flanked by two silent Vanguard security contractors. Jada was safely seated inside the courtroom gallery, already surrounded by my trusted personnel. I wore a long tan civilian trench coat, buttoned all the way up to my throat, keeping my hands casually resting in my pockets. 10 minutes later, the heavy brass doors of the courthouse lobby swung open, and Derrick made his grand entrance. Even facing 22 counts of federal wire fraud, he could not resist playing to the cameras. He stepped out of a rented luxury sedan wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He walked with that familiar, arrogant swagger, projecting the image of a wealthy, innocent black man being unfairly persecuted by a confused wife and an overzealous justice system. Flanking him was a man I instantly recognized from his billboard advertisements across the city. It was Marcus Vance, no relation to his former corporate attorney. This Vance was a notoriously sleazy, high-priced defense lawyer who specialized in manufacturing reasonable doubt for guilty millionaires. He wore a flashy silver watch and carried a thick leather briefcase looking like a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. Derricks spotted me standing near the marble pillars outside courtroom 4. A sickeningly confident smile spread across his face. He leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, who chuckled darkly before walking through the double doors to set up their defense table. Derrick did not follow him immediately. He adjusted his silk tie and walked directly toward me, his expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. My security contractors immediately stepped forward to intercept him, but I raised a single hand, commanding them to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what he had to say. Derrick stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, invading my personal space just like he had always done when he wanted to intimidate me in our kitchen. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with absolute malicious triumph. "You really thought you had me beat, Valerie?" He whispered, his voice dripping with pure arrogance. "You thought you could just seize my accounts and leak a few audio recordings to the press and I would just roll over and die? You spent 28 years taking orders from bureaucrats. You have absolutely no idea how power actually works in the real world." I kept my expression entirely blank. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I just let him talk, knowing that narcissists always reveal their exact strategy when they feel victorious. "I know exactly what you did," Derrick continued, leaning in closer, so only I could hear him over the dull roar of the crowded hallway. "You set up that Shadow LLC using your military clearances. You funneled money into my projects, and then you triggered the federal audit yourself to frame me for your own financial crimes. It was a very smart play for a glorified administrative assistant, but I am smarter." He tapped the side of his tailored jacket right over his heart, where I knew his breast pocket was located. "I have the document, Valerie. A fully notarized, ironclad prenuptial and corporate liability agreement with your exact signature on the dotted line. It proves you are the sole controlling manager of Vanguard Tactical Solutions, and that I was completely unaware of your illegal federal tax evasion." I stared at him, noting the slight sweat forming on his forehead despite his confident tone. He was banking his entire freedom on a piece of forged paper. "When we walk into that room, my lawyer is going to submit that document straight to the federal judge." Derrick whispered, his smile turning cruel and sharp. "You are going to take the fall for all 22 counts of federal fraud. They are going to strip you of your military pension. They are going to send you to a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life. And the best part, Valerie, the absolute best part, is that once you are a convicted felon, I am going to easily petition the family court for sole legal control of Jada's entire trust fund. I am going to take your money, your daughter, and your freedom all in one morning." He waited for me to react. He wanted to see fear. He wanted to see my eyes widen in panic or hear me beg for mercy, just like Heather had done the day before. I simply reached up and adjusted the stiff collar of my tan trench coat. "Are you quite finished, Derrick?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, disturbed by my absolute lack of terror. "You are going to rot in a cage, Valerie," he spat before turning on his heel and marching through the heavy wooden doors into the courtroom. I waited exactly 60 seconds before following him inside. The federal courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. The gallery was overflowing with local journalists, former investors, and nosy members of the African American elite who had come to watch the Sterling Empire officially burn. Jada sat in the front row looking nervous, but she visibly relaxed when I met her eyes and gave her a single reassuring nod. Derrick was seated at the defense table, whispering aggressively with his sleazy lawyer, who was already arranging the forged documents into a neat little pile. I walked past the wooden divider and took my seat at the plaintiff's table. A young federal prosecutor sat next to me looking over his notes. The room was buzzing with chaotic energy. Derrick looked over his shoulder at me, shooting me one final arrogant smirk. He truly believed he had won. "All rise," a loud voice boomed from the front of the room. The heavy side door opened, and the federal judge walked up to the high wooden bench. The entire courtroom stood in unison. The bailiff stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "The United States District Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing loudly. "The Honorable Judge Marcus presiding. We are here for the initial hearing and arraignment in the matter of the United States versus Derricks Sterling. Be seated," the judge commanded, banging his wooden gavel once. The crowded room sat down with a collective rustle of clothing and squeaking wooden benches. Derrick remained standing for an extra second, aggressively buttoning his suit jacket to project authority before sitting down next to his attorney. I did not sit down. I remained standing at the plaintiff's table. The judge looked down over his reading glasses, frowning slightly at my refusal to take my seat. "Are you the primary complaining witness?" "Mrs. Sterling," the judge asked, his tone strictly professional. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice projecting clearly across the massive, silent courtroom. "But I am not here as a civilian." I reached up and grabbed the lapels of my tan trench coat. With one swift, fluid motion, I unbuttoned the coat and slipped it off my shoulders, handing it to the federal prosecutor beside me. A collective sharp gasp echoed through the gallery. Derrick froze halfway into his chair, his eyes snapping toward me. His sleazy defense attorney physically dropped his pen onto the hardwood floor. Beneath the civilian coat, I was not wearing a business suit or a suburban housewife's blouse. I was wearing my full pristine Joint Special Operations Command dress uniform. The dark tailored fabric fit perfectly. The gold braids on my shoulders caught the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. And pinned directly over my heart, stacked in perfect immaculate rows, were 28 years' worth of high-level military commendations. Among them, glowing brightly, were medals of maximum distinction earned in classified combat zones that Derrick could not even begin to comprehend. The federal judge leaned back in his high leather chair, slowly taking off his reading glasses. His eyes widened in absolute stunned recognition as he stared at the highest-ranking military intelligence officer to ever step foot inside his courtroom. The silence in the federal courtroom was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Derrick stared at the heavy gold medals pinned to my chest, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. His sleazy defense attorney, Marcus Vance, swallowed hard, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating. The federal judge cleared his throat, leaning forward on the heavy wooden bench. He looked directly at me, his tone completely devoid of the usual judicial impatience. "Commander Sterling," the judge said respectfully, "you may take your seat at the plaintiff's table." I sat down next to the young federal prosecutor, keeping my posture absolutely rigid. Derrick was hyperventilating slightly at the defense table. He aggressively grabbed his attorney's arm, whispering frantically. Vance shook him off, straightening his suit jacket and standing up. He was a man who made his living manufacturing reasonable doubt, and he was not going to let a military uniform intimidate him. He mistakenly believed that no matter how many medals I wore, the piece of paper in his briefcase was the ultimate equalizer. "Your Honor," Vance said, projecting his booming voice across the gallery to ensure the local journalists heard every word. "The defense wishes to submit a critical piece of evidence at this initial hearing. We have a fully notarized corporate liability and prenuptial agreement signed directly by Valerie Sterling. This document proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that my client Derricks Sterling was entirely unaware of the federal tax evasion and offshore routing associated with Vanguard Tactical Solutions. The document clearly states that Valerie Sterling accepted sole legal and financial responsibility for all corporate entities. She is the mastermind behind this fraud. My client is simply a victim of a highly trained operative who used her military clearances to hijack his legitimate real estate empire. Vance walked confidently to the center of the room, handing the forged document to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. Derrick leaned back in his chair, shooting me a look of pure, venomous triumph. He genuinely thought he had executed the perfect checkmate. He thought he had outsmarted the federal government. The judge adjusted his glasses, reviewing the document. "This is a very serious allegation, Counselor," the judge noted, looking down at Vance. "You are submitting this as a verified legal instrument." "Absolutely, Your Honor," Vance replied smoothly. "It was signed and notarized right here in Atlanta, Georgia, on October 12th of 2015. The signature is an exact match." The young federal prosecutor sitting next to me stood up slowly. He did not look angry. He looked incredibly amused. "Your Honor, the prosecution has no objection to the defense submitting this document," the prosecutor said. "In fact, we welcome it. However, before the court accepts it into the official record, the prosecution calls our first and only expert witness to verify the authenticity of the timeline presented by the defense." The judge nodded, gesturing to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. "Call your witness." The prosecutor turned toward the gallery. "The prosecution calls General David Carter, Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General." The heavy brass doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The murmurs in the gallery instantly died. An older African-American man with silver hair and a chest completely covered in military ribbons walked down the center aisle. He wore the crisp, intimidating uniform of a four-star general. He moved with a quiet, terrifying authority that made every single person in the room sit up completely straight. Odessa Sterling, who had snuck into the back row to watch her son's trial, physically shrank back into her seat. Derrick gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning completely white as he watched the general walk past him without even blinking. General Carter took the witness stand, raising his right hand and swearing the oath with a voice that commanded absolute obedience. The prosecutor approached the stand holding a copy of the forged prenuptial agreement. General Carter, the prosecutor, began respectfully. "Can you please state your relationship to the primary complaining witness, in this case, Commander Valerie Sterling?" "She was my direct subordinate in the Joint Special Operations Command for over a decade," General Carter replied, his deep voice echoing clearly across the room. "She is one of the most decorated and lethal intelligence officers the United States military has ever produced. She handled logistics and extraction protocols in highly classified hostile environments." Derrick stared at me, his entire face completely devoid of color. He was finally hearing my actual resume spoken aloud in a federal courtroom, and it was completely shattering his fragile reality. The prosecutor handed the copy of the forged document to the general. "General Carter, the defense has submitted this document claiming Commander Sterling signed it in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, on October 12, 2015. Can you please verify if Commander Sterling was present in Atlanta on that specific date?" Derrick suddenly realized his fatal mistake. He had bribed a corrupt notary to stamp that document, choosing a random date from years ago when I had told him I was traveling out of state to visit a sick aunt. He thought he had picked a perfectly safe day to fake the timeline. He had no idea what my cover stories actually meant. General Carter did not even look at the document. He looked directly at Derrick and then at Marcus Vance. "That is completely impossible," General Carter stated, his voice cold and absolute. "Commander Sterling was nowhere near the state of Georgia on October 12th. In fact, she was not even in the Western Hemisphere." Vance stepped forward, his confident facade cracking. "Objection, Your Honor," Vance stammered. "The witness is speculating." "Overruled," the judge snapped, leaning forward, completely captivated. "Continue, General. Where exactly was Commander Sterling on that date?" On October 12, 2015, Commander Sterling was leading a highly classified extraction team in a hostile combat zone in the Middle East, General Carter testified precisely. She was actively coordinating the rescue of 3 compromised American assets under heavy enemy fire. She was entirely off the grid and unreachable for 14 days. She certainly was not sitting in an office in Atlanta signing corporate real estate documents. The courtroom erupted into chaotic whispers. The local journalists began typing furiously on their phones. Derricks slumped in his chair, his chest heaving, as the absolute sheer magnitude of his stupidity crashed down upon him. He had not just forged a document. He had inadvertently falsified the location of a high-ranking military officer during an active classified deployment. General Carter reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed folder bearing the highest level of federal classification warnings. He handed the folder directly to the court bailiff. "I have brought the fully declassified flight logs, deployment manifests, and combat action reports from that specific mission," General Carter announced. "They have been authenticated by the Pentagon and released strictly for this hearing. They prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the timeline presented by the defense is a complete physical impossibility." The bailiff carefully carried the heavily stamped folder up to the bench. The federal judge opened the file, silently reviewing the undeniable military documentation. The silence in the room was deafening. Derrick was shaking visibly, his perfectly tailored suit now looking like a cheap costume. The judge slowly closed the folder and looked up. He did not look at Derrick. He locked his furious judicial gaze directly onto Marcus Vance, the sleazy defense attorney who was currently sweating through his expensive shirt. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper that carried to the very back of the courtroom, "you just submitted forged documents to a federal court." Marcus Vance stumbled backward, knocking his heavy leather chair over in his haste to distance himself from the defense table. He raised both hands in the air, instantly abandoning all legal loyalty to his client. "Your Honor, I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this forgery," Vance stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "My client assured me this was a verified legal instrument. I immediately motioned to withdraw the document and request to formally recuse myself as defense counsel." Derrick grabbed Vance's arm, his eyes wild with sheer desperation. "You cannot do this to me!" Derrick hissed loudly enough for the front row to hear. "I paid you a massive retainer. Fix this right now." Vance violently yanked his arm free, glaring at Derrick with absolute disgust. "You lied to me about a 4-star general and a decorated military commander," he spat, grabbing his expensive briefcase. "You are entirely on your own, Sterling." The judge banged his gavel, silencing the chaotic murmurs erupting throughout the gallery. "Mr. Vance, you will sit down and remain exactly where you are until this hearing is concluded," the judge ordered sharply. "You are not leaving this room until I decide if you are facing immediate sanctions for perjury." The judge then turned his attention back to the plaintiff's table, his expression softening slightly as he looked at my uniform. "Commander Sterling, the court needs to understand the exact nature of these financial entities. Will you please take the witness stand?" I stood up, smoothing the dark, tailored fabric of my dress uniform. I walked to the wooden witness box, my polished military boots echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I raised my right hand, swearing the oath with practiced precision. Looking out across the massive courtroom, I saw Jada sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with absolute pride. I looked past her to the defense table where Derrick sat completely isolated, his arrogant facade entirely shattered. "Commander Sterling." The young federal prosecutor began stepping toward the podium. "Can you please explain the origin of Vanguard Tactical Solutions to the court? How did a military intelligence officer acquire the massive capital required to fund a major real estate empire?" I leaned forward toward the microphone. My voice was steady, carrying the weight of nearly 3 decades of service. "When you are deployed on highly classified extraction missions in hostile combat zones for 28 years, you do not have many opportunities to spend a standard salary," I explained clearly. "Furthermore, JSOC operatives operating entirely off the grid receive extreme hazardous duty pay, classified combat bonuses, and specialized government stipends. The Department of Defense Transition Program actively encourages operatives in high-risk theaters to protect these assets. My commanding officers and federal financial liaisons legally funneled every single dollar I earned into a highly secure, heavily encrypted blind trust. And this blind trust," the prosecutor prompted, gesturing toward the massive projection screen that now displayed the corporate financial web. What was its primary function domestically? Vanguard Tactical Solutions was established to strategically invest those military funds into clean civilian markets while I was deployed. I answered, keeping my cold eyes locked directly on Derrick. 15 years ago, the federal fund managers identified a struggling real estate developer in Atlanta who was facing total bankruptcy. He had a few decent plots of land, but absolutely no liquid capital and a terrible credit rating. Vanguard stepped in as an anonymous angel investor, providing the massive financial bailout that saved his failing company. Derrick sat rigidly in his heavy wooden chair. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a man. His mouth hung slightly open as his brain violently rejected the reality crashing down upon him. For 15 years, he had paraded around the city claiming to be a self-made titan of black excellence. He had belittled me in our kitchen, calling me a dependent charity case. He had genuinely believed he was a king who had graciously elevated a weak administrative clerk into high society. The psychological destruction of his ego was entirely visible from across the room. "You are telling this court," the prosecutor said, his voice rising in intentional disbelief, "that the defendant, Derrick Sterling, built his entire corporate empire using the combat pay of the very wife he claimed was financially dependent on him." "That is exactly what I am telling this court," I replied, my voice ringing like a bell in the silent room. "Every brick he laid, every luxury condo he developed, every expensive tailored suit he wore, and every country club membership he purchased to impress his wealthy friends, it was all funded by the blood and sweat of my military deployments. I owned his company before we even got married. Vanguard simply allowed him to act as the public face to maintain my operational security. He was never a titan of industry. He was just a highly paid property manager operating on my dime." A collective gasp rolled through the crowded gallery. The local journalists were scribbling furiously, utterly captivated by the massive, humiliating twist. Odessa Sterling covered her face with her hands in the back row, completely mortified by the ultimate public destruction of her golden child. Derrick looked down at his shaking hands, realizing that his entire existence, his entire identity, was an absolute pathetic lie. The prosecutor nodded, letting the heavy revelation sink into the room. "Commander Sterling, is there any remaining connection between Vanguard and the defendant? Or did he attempt to sever those ties illegally?" I reached into the interior pocket of my uniform jacket. I pulled out a thick document that had been carefully taped back together right down the middle. It was the exact paperwork I had torn in half at the Oakridge Country Club private dining room just a few days prior. I laid it flat on the wooden ledge of the witness stand. When the defendant realized his offshore accounts were frozen by the federal government, he attempted one final desperate maneuver. I said, tapping the taped document. "He cornered our 21-year-old daughter at a restaurant. He tried to physically and emotionally coerce her into signing this transfer agreement. He explicitly told her it was a legal requirement to secure her trust fund and save the family legacy." The prosecutor approached the stand, taking the document and handing it up to the judge. "Your Honor, I ask that you read the fine print on page 4, subsection B." The judge put his reading glasses back on, scanning the dense legal jargon. His judicial neutrality cracked instantly. His face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute disgust. He looked down at Derrick with a glare that could melt steel. "This is not a wealth transfer agreement," the judge stated, his voice thick with heavy contempt. "This document is a legally binding assumption of liability. If this young woman had signed this paper, she would not have received a single dime of any trust fund. She would have officially accepted the entirety of Derrick Sterling's federal tax debt and assumed full personal criminal liability for his failing shell companies." The gallery erupted in outraged whispers. Jada covered her mouth, tears of betrayal welling in her eyes as she realized exactly what her father had tried to do to her. I looked directly at Derrick, holding his terrified gaze, refusing to let him look away. He was perfectly willing to send his own daughter to federal prison just to buy himself a few more weeks of freedom, I said, my voice ice cold. The sheer revulsion that erupted in the courtroom was immediate and absolutely deafening. Gasps of horror and muttered curses rolled down from the crowded gallery. Reporters shook their heads in absolute disgust. To steal from your wife was a federal crime, but to deliberately orchestrate the federal imprisonment of your own child to shield your fragile ego was an act of profound, unimaginable cowardice. Marcus Vance, the high-priced defense attorney who had built an entire lucrative career defending guilty men, stood up from the defense table. His face was flushed dark red with anger and professional terror. He aggressively shoved his expensive legal pads and gold pens into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. Derrick panicked. He reached out and grabbed Vance's tailored sleeve, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. "What are you doing?" Derrick hissed, his voice cracking. "You cannot leave me right now. You have to object. You have to cross-examine her." Vance violently ripped his arm away from Derrick's grasp. "Cross-examine a decorated military commander who just caught you forging federal documents and trying to frame your own daughter," Vance shot back, his voice loud enough for the court reporter to transcribe every single word. "I am a defense attorney, Sterling, not an accomplice to treason and child abuse. You lied to me from the very first consultation. I am completely done with you." "Your Honor," Vance called out, turning to face the bench and raising both hands in a gesture of total surrender. "I formally request immediate withdrawal as defense counsel for Derrick Sterling. My client has actively deceived this firm and utilized our services to present fraudulent materials to a federal judge. I will submit myself to any disciplinary hearings required by the state bar, but I will not spend another second sitting next to this man." The federal judge looked down at the frantic, sweating real estate developer and then back to the attorney. "Request granted, Mr. Vance," the judge stated coldly. "You are dismissed from this table." Vance did not even look back. He grabbed his briefcase and power-walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, pushing past the heavy wooden doors and disappearing into the hallway. Derrick was left sitting completely alone at the massive defense table. The physical isolation perfectly mirrored the total destruction of his life. He looked over his shoulder toward the gallery, searching desperately for a friendly face. He looked for his mother. Odessa Sterling was sitting in the back row, her face buried in her hands, weeping out of pure social mortification. She refused to meet his eyes. The rest of his elite country club peers, the men and women who had drank his expensive champagne and praised his business acumen, were glaring at him with open hostility. The immaculate facade of black excellence that Derrick had cultivated for 15 years finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The arrogant swagger, the booming authoritative voice, the condescending sneer, they all completely evaporated in an instant. He slumped forward in his heavy leather chair, resting his forehead against the polished wood of the defense table. Then a sound escaped his throat. It was a high-pitched, wretched sob. The great titan of industry began to weep. It was not a dignified cry, it was the pathetic, gasping wail of a narcissist who had finally run out of lies and scapegoats. He stood up, his knees visibly shaking, and looked up at the federal judge. "Your Honor, please." Derrick begged, tears streaming down his face, ruining his expensive silk tie. "You have to understand my situation. I was under immense financial pressure. The markets were turning against me. I did not mean to hurt Jada. I was just trying to buy enough time to restructure the corporate debt. I am a good man. I built community centers. I fund scholarships for our people. You cannot send me to prison. I will not survive in a federal penitentiary." The judge stared at him with an expression of absolute stone. "You funded those scholarships with stolen military compensation," Mr. Sterling, the judge, corrected him, his voice echoing sharply across the silent room. "You are not a good man. You are a parasite." Realizing he was getting absolutely nowhere with the judge, Derrick turned his desperate, tear-streaked face toward the witness box. He looked directly at me. He stumbled away from the defense table, taking a clumsy step toward the center of the room. The federal bailiffs instantly reached for their duty belts, but the judge held up a single hand, pausing them to see what the disgraced man would do next. Derrick fell to his knees right in the middle of the federal courtroom. The expensive fabric of his tailored trousers hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me like a drowning man begging for a life raft. "Valerie, please," he sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically. "Please, my beautiful wife. I am so sorry. I lost my way. I let the money and the power corrupt me. But everything I did, every building I bought, every deal I made, I did it for us. I did it to build a legacy for our family. I wanted to give you and Jada the world. I sat in the witness box looking down at the man I had lived with for over a decade. I looked at his shaking hands and his tear-stained face. I felt absolutely nothing. "You did not do any of this for us, Derrick," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. "You did it because you were terrified of being nothing. You were terrified that if people knew your wife was the one holding the checkbook, they would see exactly how small you truly are. You used my money to build a throne of lies, and then you tried to sacrifice our daughter to keep it from collapsing. There is no apology in the world that can fix what you are." Derrick let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure defeat. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing hysterically on the floor of the courtroom. The gallery watched in absolute stunned silence as the former king of the city groveled in his own misery. I turned my attention away from him and looked directly at the judge. The young federal prosecutor stepped forward, his face set with grim determination. "Your Honor, given the defendant's explicit attempt to utilize forged documents to deceive this court, and his demonstrated willingness to manipulate family members to evade federal prosecution, the state views Derrick Sterling as an extreme flight risk. We request that his bail be completely denied." The judge did not even need to review the files on his desk. He looked at the weeping man on the floor with utter disdain. "I completely agree," the judge announced, his voice booming with final judicial authority. "Derrick Sterling, based on the overwhelming evidence of severe financial fraud, forgery, and the absolute lack of any moral compass, you are officially deemed a high-level flight risk and a danger to the integrity of this investigation. Bail is categorically denied." The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, raising it high in the air. "You are hereby remanded directly into federal custody, pending the full duration of your criminal trial," the judge declared. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the massive courtroom. The sound signaled the absolute permanent end of Derrick Sterling's life as a free man. Two heavily armed federal marshals immediately stepped out from the shadows near the judge's bench. They marched briskly toward the center of the room, where Derrick was still kneeling on the hardwood floor. They did not ask him to stand. One marshal grabbed his left arm while the other grabbed his right, hauling him violently up to his feet. Derrick gasped, struggling weakly against their iron grips. "No, wait!" he pleaded, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a savior that did not exist. "Please wait." The sound of heavy steel ratcheting filled the quiet courtroom as the marshals pulled out a pair of thick federal handcuffs. The cold metal clamped down viciously around Derrick's wrists, locking his hands securely behind his back. The physical reality of the heavy steel seemed to finally shatter the last desperate remnants of his narcissistic delusion. He stopped struggling against the federal marshals and let his head drop, his broad shoulders slumping forward in total, absolute defeat. The metallic click echoed loudly through the cavernous room, serving as the final punctuation mark on his fabricated life. The judge looked out over the crowded courtroom, ensuring absolute silence before delivering the final financial blow. In addition to remanding the defendant directly into federal custody, the court is issuing an immediate and comprehensive freeze on all remaining assets associated with Derrick Sterling and his various shell corporations, the judge announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. The judge looked down at the court clerk, handing over a thickly stacked federal order signed in bold black ink. Furthermore, given the irrefutable evidence presented today that the entirety of his corporate portfolio was built utilizing stolen military compensation, I am signing an emergency restitution mandate, the judge continued. Effective immediately. Total legal and operational control of all real estate holdings, domestic bank accounts, physical properties, and commercial developments currently held by Sterling Enterprises is hereby transferred back to Vanguard Tactical Solutions under the sole command of Commander Valerie Sterling. The stroke of the judge's pen effectively erased 15 years of Derrick's arrogant theft in a matter of seconds. He was leaving the federal courtroom with absolutely nothing but the tailored charcoal suit on his back, and even that expensive fabric had been paid for by my hazardous duty pay. Derrick did not even look up as the two heavily armed marshals jerked him forward, forcing him to walk down the long center aisle. The crowded gallery parted for him not out of respect, but out of sheer unadulterated disgust. Local journalists snapped rapid-fire photographs of the disgraced Titan shuffling awkwardly in his heavy steel chains, his head bowed in profound public humiliation. The men and women of the elite African-American community who had worshipped him just 24 hours ago now turned their backs as he passed. I watched him disappear through the heavy side doors of the federal holding cell without feeling a single ounce of pity. The parasite had finally been excised. I stepped down from the elevated wooden witness box, the solid thud of my polished military boots grounding me in the reality of the victory. I walked over to the gallery barrier where Jada was standing. She immediately threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in the dark fabric of my dress uniform shoulder. I held my daughter tightly, resting my chin against her hair, letting out a long, steady breath. We had won the war. The empire was securely ours and the toxic threat was permanently removed. But the Sterling family toxicity had one final desperate gasp left to offer. As the massive courtroom slowly began to empty, clearing out into the busy marble hallway, I heard the frantic clicking of expensive heels approaching rapidly from behind. I turned around, keeping one arm securely wrapped around Jada. Odessa Sterling was pushing her way aggressively past a small group of lingering reporters, her face streaked with ruined expensive makeup. The ruthless matriarch of the family looked absolutely frantic. Her designer silk dress looked rumpled and the aristocratic arrogance she had wielded like a weapon for decades was completely gone, replaced by sheer animal panic. She practically threw herself at my feet, stopping just short of grabbing the fabric of my uniform pants. "Valerie, my beautiful daughter." Odessa wept, her voice pitching into a hysterical theatrical wail that echoed off the high ceiling. "You have to listen to me. I had absolutely no idea what Derrick was doing behind closed doors. You know I would never condone such horrific financial crimes against you or my precious granddaughter. I am a victim of his cruel manipulation just like you are." I stared down at the woman who had spent 15 years treating me like absolute garbage. This was the exact same woman who had called me a stray dog in my own kitchen and aggressively demanded I sign away my marital rights just 48 hours ago. Her sudden maternal affection was deeply sickening. "Please, Valerie," Odessa begged, clasping her manicured hands together in front of her chest. "Mr. Vance just called me before he fled the courthouse parking lot. He told me what the judge's restitution order actually means for the family. He told me that Sterling Enterprises does not exist anymore. Valerie, my beautiful home, the sprawling estate I have lived in for 20 years, it was technically owned by Derricks Commercial Holding Company. The private bank accounts I used to pay my household staff and my expensive medical bills, they were all corporate accounts." Odessa was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with the terrifying realization of her new impoverished reality. The federal government just froze everything. She sobbed loudly, drawing the attention of the remaining journalists who turned their cameras toward the pathetic scene. "I cannot even access my grocery money. I have absolutely nowhere to go, Valerie. You are my family. You are the only family I have left now that Derrick has ruined us. You cannot let an old woman sleep on the streets. We can go back to the estate together. I can help you raise Jada. I can be the mother you never had." Jada scoffed, stepping out from under my arm and looking at her grandmother with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You told me my mother was a pathetic charity case," Jada snapped, her voice ringing out clearly in the emptying courtroom. "You told me I should be embarrassed of her and that I belonged solely to Derrick. You are not our family." Odessa ignored Jada entirely, keeping her desperate tear-filled eyes locked onto my face. She reached out and lightly touched the gold braid on my shoulder, trying to physically bridge the massive gap she had spent years aggressively digging. "Please, Valerie," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. "I am begging you. I need a place to live." I looked down at her trembling hand and then slowly looked up into her panicked eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the searing anger I had swallowed for 15 years. I let the absolute cold reality of my military discipline guide my final words to the woman who had tormented me. You always said I did not belong in your house, Odessa. I said, my voice slicing through her fake tears like a perfectly sharpened blade. Congratulations! You were right. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. Odessa stood completely frozen. Her jaw trembled as the absolute finality of my words struck her like a physical blow. The aristocratic arrogance she had worn like a suit of armor for her entire adult life shattered completely right there in the empty gallery. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry, yielding nothing but a pathetic, breathless gasp. The realization that she was truly homeless, officially evicted by the very woman she had spent a decade tormenting and belittling, finally paralyzed her. I did not wait for her to formulate a desperate response or offer another fake apology. I simply turned my back on the matriarch of the Sterling family, leaving her standing entirely alone to marinate in the absolute destruction of her own making. I placed my hand gently on Jada's shoulder, guiding my daughter away from the weeping woman, and toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the federal courtroom. The marble corridors of the federal building felt completely different now. When I had walked in this morning, the atmosphere felt incredibly oppressive, like a hostile battlefield. Now it felt like a conquered territory. My polished military boots echoed with a steady rhythmic cadence against the stone floors. Federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court clerks stopped dead in their tracks, stepping respectfully aside to let us pass. They stared in absolute awe at the heavy gold medals pinned to my chest, finally understanding exactly who had just orchestrated the most surgical financial takedown in the history of the city. I kept my posture rigid, my chin raised, holding the quiet, dignified power of a commander who had successfully completed her final mission. We reached the massive main lobby of the courthouse. Through the towering glass doors, I could see the absolute chaos waiting for us outside on the concrete steps. The press presence had aggressively multiplied while we were inside. It was no longer just the local Atlanta news networks looking for a scandalous society story. National syndicates had caught wind of the disgraced real estate titan and his secret military intelligence wife. A sprawling sea of microphones, television cameras, and shouting journalists formed an impenetrable wall of aggressive media blocking the main exit entirely. But the Department of Defense actively protects its own. Before I even pushed the heavy glass doors open, a highly coordinated tactical perimeter materialized. 6 massive military police officers wearing crisp dark uniforms and stark white MP armbands marched aggressively up the concrete steps from the street level. They moved with terrifying precision, shoving the civilian reporters backward, using their physical presence to create a wide, secure corridor straight down the center of the courthouse steps. A young military captain stepped forward, breaking away from the perimeter and rendering a flawless, crisp salute. "Your transport is waiting securely at the curb." "Commander," the captain said, his voice cutting clearly and authoritatively through the chaotic shouting of the surrounding journalists. "We will ensure your exit is completely unobstructed." I returned the salute with sharp military precision, acknowledging the respect of a fellow soldier. I pushed through the glass doors and walked out into the biting morning air. The flashbulbs erupted instantly, flashing like a localized lightning storm, blindingly bright against the gray sky. Dozens of reporters screamed my name, begging for an exclusive quote, asking how it felt to dismantle a massive corporate empire in a single morning. They shoved microphones toward the military barricade, desperate for a soundbite. I did not look at a single one of them. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, projecting the absolute unbreakable stoicism of a veteran who had survived much worse environments than a crowd of eager civilians with cameras. At the very bottom of the wide concrete steps, a heavy armored federal transport cruiser idled loudly by the curb. The thick steel back doors were swung wide open, exposing the dark cage inside. 2 federal marshals were in the process of aggressively shoving Derrick into the back of the transport. He stumbled awkwardly, his expensive charcoal suit completely ruined. The heavy steel chains binding his wrists and ankles clanked loudly and pathetically against the reinforced floorboards of the cruiser. As the marshals forced him onto the hard metal bench, he managed to twist his body around, looking out into the blinding daylight. He saw me descending the courthouse steps, flanked by a wall of military police looking completely untouchable and entirely victorious. "Valerie, he screamed at the top of his lungs. It was a raw, desperate sound that scraped painfully against the cold morning air. It was the agonizing wail of a broken narcissist begging for one final ounce of attention from the primary source he had drained for years. "Valerie, please look at me," Derricks shouted, his voice cracking as he strained against the heavy federal chains. "You cannot leave me like this." I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. I did not even turn my head a single fraction of an inch to acknowledge his existence. Total indifference is the ultimate weapon against a narcissist, and I wielded it with lethal perfection. The heavy steel doors of the transport cruiser slammed shut with a definitive booming thud, cutting off his pathetic screams forever. The engine roared deeply, and the massive vehicle merged aggressively into the downtown traffic, carrying my former husband away to a federal penitentiary where his fragile ego would be systematically and permanently crushed. I reached the bottom of the steps where my own armored SUV was idling quietly behind the military police barricade. Jada was already standing by the open passenger door waiting for me. She did not look scared anymore. The heavy, crushing weight of the Sterling family expectations, the toxic gaslighting, the constant racial microaggressions from Heather, and the suffocating pressure of Derrick's fake empire were entirely gone from her young shoulders. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. She was no longer looking at the submissive housewife who baked artisan bread and endured insults in silence. She was looking at the woman who had endured years of emotional abuse just to patiently build the most flawless, inescapable trap imaginable. She saw a titan. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," Jada whispered, her voice filled with absolute fierce pride as the wind whipped her hair across her face. I smiled, reaching out to gently tuck a stray braid behind her ear, my combat-hardened exterior finally softening. "I am just a mother protecting her child," I replied softly, pulling her into a brief, tight embrace. "Let us go home." We climbed into the quiet, heavily armored interior of the SUV. The heavy doors closed firmly, shutting out the frantic screams of the media and the cold, biting wind. The cabin smelled like rich leather and quiet victory. I unbuttoned the stiff collar of my dress uniform and carefully took off the heavy jacket, feeling the massive weight of the gold medals lift from my chest. I folded the dark fabric, neatly placing it on the empty seat beside me. I leaned back against the plush leather headrest and let out a long, happy, exhausted sigh. The war was officially over. I turned to my daughter, a genuine, warm smile spreading completely across my face for the first time in over a decade. Now I asked, my voice light and completely free, "Who wants to go look for a new house?" The driver shifted the massive vehicle into gear, pulling smoothly away from the curb. We drove away from the courthouse, leaving the absolute ruins of the antagonist shrinking rapidly in the rearview mirror, heading straight toward a perfectly unwritten future.